and desired him to bring him that very sword with which he himself slew Caius. 15 So he was happily killed at one stroke. But Lupus did not meet with such good fortune in going out of the world, since he was timorous, and had many blows levelled at his neck, because he did not stretch it out boldly as he ought to have done. 6. Now, a few days after this, as the parental solemnities were just at hand, the Roman multitude made their usual oblations to their several ghosts, and put portions into the fire in honor of Churia, and besought him to be merciful to them, and not continue his anger against them for their ingratitude. And this was the end of the life that Churia came to. But for Sabinus, although Claudius not only set him at liberty, but gave him leave to retain his former command in the army, yet did he think it would be unjust in him to fail of performing his obligations to his fellow confederates. So he fell upon his sword, and killed himself, the wound reaching up to the very hilt of the sword. Chapter 5. How Claudius restored to Agrippa his grandfather's kingdoms and augmented his dominions. And how he published an edict in behalf. 1. Now when Claudius had taken out of the way all those soldiers whom he suspected, which he did immediately, he published an edict, and therein confirmed that kingdom to Agrippa which Caius had given him, and therein commended the king highly. He also made all addition to it of all that country over which Herod, who was his grandfather, had reigned, that is, Judea and Samaria. And this he restored to him as due to his family. But for Abila 16 of Lysanias, and all that lay at Mount Libanus, he bestowed them upon him, as out of his own territories. He also made a league with this Agrippa, confirmed by oaths, in the middle of the forum, in the city of Rome. He also took away from Antiochus that kingdom which he was possessed of, but gave him a certain part of Cilicia and Commagena. He also set Alexander Lysimachus, the Alabarch, at liberty, who had been his old friend, and steward to his mother Antonia, but had been imprisoned by Caius, whose son Marcus married Bernice, the daughter of Agrippa. But when Marcus, Alexander's son, was dead, who had married her when she was a virgin, Agrippa gave her in marriage to his brother Herod, and begged for him of Claudius the kingdom of Chalcis. 2. Now about this time there was a sedition between the Jews and the Greeks, at the city of Alexandria. For when Caius was dead, the nation of the Jews, which had been very much mortified under the reign of Caius, and reduced to very great distress by the people of Alexandria, recovered itself, and immediately took up their arms to fight for themselves. So Claudius sent an order to the president of Egypt to quiet that tumult. He also sent an edict, at the requests of King Agrippa and King Herod, both to Alexandria and to Syria, whose contents were as follows: Tiberius Claudius Cr. Augustus Germanicus, high priest, and tribune of the people, ordains thus: since I am assured that the Jews of Alexandria, called Alexandrians, have been joint inhabitants in the earliest times with the Alexandrians, and have obtained from their kings equal privileges with them, as is evident by the public records that are in their possession, and the edicts themselves. And that after Alexandria had been subjected to our empire by Augustus, their rights and privileges have been preserved by those presidents who have at divers times been sent thither. And that no dispute had been raised about those rights and privileges, even when Aquila was governor of Alexandria. And that when the Jewish ethnarch was dead, Augustus did not prohibit the making such ethnarchs, as willing that all men should be so subject to the Romans as to continue in the observation of their own customs, and not be forced to transgress the ancient rules of their own country religion. But that, in the time of Caius, the Alexandrians became insolent towards the Jews that were among them, which Caius, out of his great madness and want of understanding, reduced the nation of the Jews very low, because they would not transgress the religious worship of their country, and call him a god. I will therefore that the nation of the Jews be not deprived of their rights and privileges, on account of the madness of Caius, but that those rights and privileges which they formerly enjoyed be preserved to them, and that they may continue in their own customs. And I charge both parties to take very great care that no troubles may arise after the promulgation of this edict. 3. And such were the contents of this edict on behalf of the Jews that was sent to Alexandria. But the edict that was sent into the other parts of the habitable earth was this which follows: Tiberius Claudius Cr. Augustus Germanicus, high priest, tribune of the people, chosen consul the second time, ordains thus, upon the petition of King Agrippa and King Herod, who are persons very dear to me, that I would grant the same rights and privileges should be preserved to the Jews which are in all the Roman Empire, which I have granted to those of Alexandria. I very willingly comply therewith. And this grant I make not only for the sake of the petitioners, but as judging those Jews for whom I have been petitioned worthy of such a favor, on account of their fidelity and friendship to the Romans. I think it also very just that no Grecian city should be deprived of such rights and privileges, since they were preserved to them under the great Augustus. It will therefore be fit to permit the Jews, who are in all the world under us, to keep their ancient customs without being hindered so to do. And I do charge them also to use this my kindness to them with moderation, and not to show a contempt of the superstitious observances of other nations, but to keep their own laws only. And I will that this decree of mine be engraven on tables by the magistrates of the cities, and colonies, and municipal places, both those within Italy and those without it, both kings and governors, by the means of the ambassadors, and to have them exposed to the public for full 30 days, in such a place whence it may plainly be read from the ground. 17. Chapter 6. What things were done by Agrippa at Jerusalem when he was returned back into Judea, and what it was that Petronius wrote to the inhabitants of Doris, in behalf. 1. Now Claudius Cr., by these decrees of his which were sent to Alexandria, and to all the habitable earth, made known what opinion he had of the Jews. So he soon sent Agrippa away to take his kingdom, now he was advanced to a more illustrious dignity than before, and sent letters to the presidents and procurators of the provinces that they should treat him very kindly. Accordingly, he returned in haste, as was likely he would. Now he returned in much greater prosperity than he had before. He also came to Jerusalem, and offered all the sacrifices that belonged to him, and omitted nothing which the law required. 18. On which account he ordained that many of the Nazarites should have their heads shorn. And for the golden chain which had been given him by Caius, of equal weight with that iron chain wherewith his royal hands had been bound, he hung it up within the limits of the temple, over the treasury. 19. That it might be a memorial of the severe fate he had lain under, and a testimony of his change for the better. That it might be a demonstration how the greatest prosperity may have a fall, and that God sometimes raises up what is fallen down. For this chain thus dedicated afforded a document to all men, that King Agrippa had been once bound in a chain for a small cause, but recovered his former dignity again, and a little while afterward got out of his bonds, and was advanced to be a more illustrious king than he was before. Whence men may understand that all that partake of human nature, how great soever they are, may fall, and that those that fall may gain their former illustrious dignity again. 2. And when Agrippa had entirely finished all the duties of the divine worship, he removed Theophilus, the son of Ananus, from the high priesthood, and bestowed that honor of his on Simon the son of Boethus, whose name was also Cantheras, whose daughter King Herod married, as I have related above. Simon, therefore, had the high priesthood with his brethren, and with his father, in like manner as the sons of Simon, the son of Onias, who were 3, had it formerly under the government of the Macedonians, as we have related in a former book. 3. When the king had settled the high priesthood after this manner, he returned the kindness which the inhabitants of Jerusalem had showed him. For he released them from the tax upon houses, every one of which paid it before, thinking it a good thing to requite the tender affection of those that loved him. He also made Silas the general of his forces, as a man who had partaken with him in many of his troubles. But after a very little while the young men of Doris, preferring a rash attempt before piety, and being naturally bold and insolent, carried a statue of Cr into a synagogue of the Jews, and erected it there. This procedure of theirs greatly provoked Agrippa, for it plainly tended to the dissolution of the laws of his country. So he came without delay to Publius Petronius, who was then president of Syria, and accused the people of Doris. Nor did he less resent what was done than did Agrippa. For he judged it a piece of impiety to transgress the laws that regulate the actions of men. So he wrote the following letter to the people of Doris in an angry strain: Publius Petronius, the president under Tiberius Claudius Cr. Augustus Germanicus, to the magistrates of Doris, ordains as follows: since some of you have had the boldness, or madness rather, after the edict of Claudius Cr. Augustus Germanicus was published, for permitting the Jews to observe the laws of their country, not to obey the same, but have acted in entire opposition thereto, as forbidding the Jews to assemble together in the synagogue, by removing Cr's statue, and setting it up therein, and thereby have offended not only the Jews, but the emperor himself, whose statue is more commodiously placed in his own temple than in a foreign one, where is the place of assembling together. While it is but a part of natural justice, that every one should have the power over the place belonging peculiarly to themselves, according to the determination of Cr. O say nothing of my own determination, which it would be ridiculous to mention after the emperor's edict, which gives the Jews leave to make use of their own customs, as also gives order that they enjoy equally the rights of citizens with the Greeks themselves. Therefore ordain that Proculus Vitellius, the centurion, bring those men to me, who, contrary to Augustus's edict, have been so insolent as to do this thing, at which those very men, who appear to be of principal reputation among them, have an indignation also, and allege for themselves, that it was not done with their consent, but by the violence of the multitude, that they may give an account of what hath been done. I also exhort the principal magistrates among them, unless they have a mind to have this action esteemed to be done with their consent, to inform the centurion of those that were guilty of it, and take care that no handle be hence taken for raising a sedition or quarrel among them, which those seem to me to treat after who encourage such doings. While both I myself, and King Agrippa, for whom I have the highest honor, have nothing more under our care, than that the nation of the Jews may have no occasion given them of getting together, under the pretense of avenging themselves, and become tumultuous, and that it may be more publicly known what Augustus hath resolved about this whole matter, I have subjoined those edicts which he hath lately caused to be published at Alexandria, and which, although they may be well known to all, yet did King Agrippa, for whom I have the highest honor, read them at that time before my tribunal, and pleaded that the Jews ought not to be deprived of those rights which Augustus hath granted them. I therefore charge you, that you do not, for the time to come, seek for any occasion of sedition or disturbance, but that every one be allowed to follow their own religious customs. 4. Thus did Petronius take care of this matter, that such a breach of the law might be corrected, and that no such thing might be attempted afterwards against the Jews. And now King Agrippa took the high priesthood away from Simon Cantheras, and put Jonathan, the son of Ananus, into it again, and owned that he was more worthy of that dignity than the other. But this was not a thing acceptable to him, to recover that his former dignity. So he refused it, and said, O king, I rejoice in the honor that thou hast for me, and take it kindly that thou wouldst give me such a dignity of thy own inclinations, although God hath judged that I am not at all worthy of the high priesthood. I am satisfied with having once put on the sacred garments, for I then put them on after a more holy manner than I should now receive them again. But if thou desirest that a person more worthy than myself should have this honorable employment, give me leave to name thee such a one. I have a brother that is pure from all sin against God, and of all offences against thyself. I recommend him to thee, as one that is fit for this dignity. So the king was pleased with these words of his, and passed by Jonathan, and, according to his brother's desire, bestowed the high priesthood upon Matthias. Nor was it long before Marcus succeeded Petronius, as president of Syria. Chapter 7. Concerning Silas, and on what account it was that King Agrippa was angry at him. How Agrippa began to encompass Jerusalem with a wall, and what benefits he bestowed on the inhabitants of Brytus. 1. Now Silas, the general of the king's horse, because he had been faithful to him under all his misfortunes, and had never refused to be a partaker with him in any of his dangers, but had oftentimes undergone the most hazardous dangers for him, was full of assurance, and thought he might expect a sort of equality with the king, on account of the firmness of the friendship he had showed to him. Accordingly, he would nowhere let the king sit as his superior, and took the like liberty in speaking to him upon all occasions, till he became troublesome to the king, when they were merry together, extolling himself beyond measure, and oft putting the king in mind of the severity of fortune he had undergone, that he might, by way of ostentation, demonstrate what zeal he had showed in his service. And was continually harping upon this string, what pains he had taken for him, and much enlarged still upon that subject. The repetition of this so frequently seemed to reproach the king, insomuch that he took this ungovernable liberty of talking very ill at his hands. For the commemoration of times when men have been under ignominy, is by no means agreeable to them. And he is a very silly man who was perpetually relating to a person what kindness he had done him. At last, therefore, Silas had so thoroughly provoked the king's indignation, that he acted rather out of passion than good consideration, and did not only turn Silas out of his place, as general of his horse, but sent him in bonds into his own country. But the edge of his anger wore off by length of time, and made room for more just reasonings as to his judgment about this man. And he considered how many labors he had undergone for his sake. So when Agrippa was solemnizing his birthday, and he gave festival entertainments to all his subjects, he sent for Silas on the sudden to be his guest. But as he was a very frank man, he thought he had now a just handle given him to be angry, which he could not conceal from those that came for him, but said to them, "What honor is this the king invites me to, which I conclude will soon be over? For the king hath not let me keep those original marks of the goodwill I bore him, which I once had from him. But he hath plundered me, and that unjustly also. Does he think that I can leave off that liberty of speech, which, upon the consciousness of my deserts, I shall use more loudly than before, and shall relate how many misfortunes I have been delivered from, how many labors I have undergone for him, whereby I procured him deliverance and respect, as a reward for which I have borne the hardships of bonds and a dark prison? I shall never forget this usage. Nay, perhaps, my very soul, when it is departed out of the body, will not forget the glorious actions I did on his account." This was the clamor he made, and he ordered the messengers to tell it to the king. So he perceived that Silas was incurable in his folly, and still suffered him to lie in prison. 2. As for the walls of Jerusalem, that were adjoining to the new city Bezetha, he repaired them at the expense of the public, and built them wider in breadth, and higher in altitude. And he had made them too strong for all human power to demolish, unless Marcus, the then president of Syria, had by letter informed Claudius Cr of what he was doing. And when Claudius had some suspicion of attempts for innovation, he sent to Agrippa to leave off the building of those walls presently. So he obeyed, as not thinking it proper to contradict Claudius. 3. Now this king was by nature very beneficent and liberal in his gifts, and very ambitious to oblige people with such large donations. And he made himself very illustrious by the many chargeable presents he made them. He took delight in giving, and rejoiced in living with good reputation. He was not at all like that Herod who reigned before him. For that Herod was ill-natured, and severe in his punishments, and had no mercy on them that he hated. And everyone perceived that he was more friendly to the Greeks than to the Jews. For he adorned foreign cities with large presents in money, with building them baths and theatres besides. Nay, in some of those places he erected temples, and porticos in others. But he did not vouchsafe to raise one of the least edifices in any Jewish city, or make them any donation that was worth mentioning. But Agrippa's temper was mild, and equally liberal to all men. He was humane to foreigners, and made them sensible of his liberality. He was in like manner rather of a gentle and compassionate temper. Accordingly, he loved to live continually at Jerusalem, and was exactly careful in the observance of the laws of his country. He therefore kept himself entirely pure, nor did any day pass over his head without its appointed sacrifice. 4. However, there was a certain mall of the Jewish nation at Jerusalem, who appeared to be very accurate in the knowledge of the law. His name was Simon. This man got together an assembly, while the king was absent at Syria, and had the insolence to accuse him as not living holily, and that he might justly be excluded out of the temple, since it belonged only to native Jews. But the general of Agrippa's army informed him that Simon had made such a speech to the people. So the king sent for him. And as he was sitting in the theatre, he bid him sit down by him, and said to him with a low and gentle voice, "What is there done in this place that is contrary to the law?" But he had nothing to say for himself, but begged his pardon. So the king was more easily reconciled to him than one could have imagined, as esteeming mildness a better quality in a king than anger, and knowing that moderation is more becoming in great men than passion. So he made Simon a small present, and dismissed him. 5. Now as Agrippa was a great builder in many places, he paid a peculiar regard to the people of Brytus. For he erected a theatre for them, superior to many others of that sort, both in sumptuousness and elegance, as also an amphitheatre, built at vast expenses. And besides these, he built them baths and porticos, and spared for no costs in any of his edifices, to render them both handsome and large. He also spent a great deal upon their dedication, and exhibited shows upon them, and brought thither musicians of all sorts, and such as made the most delightful music of the greatest variety. He also showed his magnificence upon the theatre, in his great number of gladiators. And there it was that he exhibited the several antagonists, in order to please the spectators. No fewer indeed than 700 men to fight with 700 other men 20, and allotted all the malefactors he had for this exercise, that both the malefactors might receive their punishment, and that this operation of war might be a recreation in peace. And thus were these criminals all destroyed at once. Chapter 8. What other acts were done by Agrippa until his death, and after what manner he died. 1. When Agrippa had finished what I have above related at Berytus, he removed to Tiberias, a city of Galilee. Now he was in great esteem among other kings. Accordingly there came to him Antiochus, king of Commalena, Sampsigeratnus, king of Amasa, and Codes, who was king of the Lesser Armenia, and Polemo, who was king of Pontus, as also Herod his brother, who was king of Chalcis. All these he treated with agreeable entertainments, and after an obliging manner, and so as to exhibit the greatness of his mind, and so as to appear worthy of those respects which the kings paid to him, by coming thus to see him. However, while these kings stayed with him, Marcus, the president of Syria, came thither. So the king, in order to preserve the respect that was due to the Romans, went out of the city to meet him, as far as 7 furlongs. But this proved to be the beginning of a difference between him and Marcus. For he took with him in his chariot those other kings as his assessors. But Marcus had a suspicion what the meaning could be of so great a friendship of these kings one with another, and did not think so close an agreement of so many potentates to be for the interest of the Romans. He therefore sent some of his domestics to every one of them, and enjoined them to go their ways home without further delay. This was very ill taken by Agrippa, who after that became his enemy. And now he took the high priesthood away from Matthias, and made Eleonius, the son of Cantheras, high priest in his stead. 2. Now when Agrippa had reigned 3 years over all Judea, he came to the city Syria, which was formerly called Strato's Tower. And there he exhibited shows in honor of Cr, upon his being informed that there was a certain festival celebrated to make vows for his safety. At which festival a great multitude was gotten together of the principal persons, and such as were of dignity through his province. On the 2nd day of which shows he put on a garment made wholly of silver, and of a contexture truly wonderful, and came into the theatre early in the morning. at which time the silver of his garment being illuminated by the fresh reflection of the sun's rays upon it, shone out after a surprising manner, and was so resplendent as to spread a horror over those that looked intently upon him. And presently his flatterers cried out, one from one place, and another from another, though not for his good, that he was a god. And they added, Be thou merciful to us. For although we have hitherto reverenced thee only as a man, yet shall we henceforth own thee as superior to mortal nature. Upon this the king did neither rebuke them, nor reject their impious flattery. But as he presently afterward looked up, he saw an owl 21 sitting on a certain rope over his head, and immediately understood that this bird was the messenger of ill tidings, as it had once been the messenger of good tidings to him, and fell into the deepest sorrow. A severe pain also arose in his belly, and began in a most violent manner. He therefore looked upon his friends, and said, I, whom you call a god, am commanded presently to depart this life. While Providence thus reproves the lying words you just now said to me. And I, who was by you called immortal, am immediately to be hurried away by death. But I am bound to accept of what Providence allots, as it pleases God. For we have by no means lived ill, but in a splendid and happy manner. When he said this, his pain was become violent. Accordingly he was carried into the palace, and the rumor went abroad everywhere, that he would certainly die in a little time. But the multitude presently sat in sackcloth, with their wives and children, after the law of their country, and besought God for the king's recovery. All places were also full of mourning and lamentation. Now the king rested in a high chamber, and as he saw them below lying prostrate on the ground, he could not himself forbear weeping. And when he had been quite worn out by the pain in his belly for 5 days, he departed this life, being in the 54th year of his age, and in the 7th year of his reign. For he reigned 4 years under Kcr, 3 of them were over Philip's tetrarchy only, and on the 4th he had that of Herod added to it. And he reigned, besides those, 3 years under the reign of Claudius Cr. In which time he reigned over the forementioned countries, and also had Judea added to them, as well as Samaria and Syria. The revenues that he received out of them were very great, no less than 12 millions of drachmae. 22 Yet did he borrow great sums from others. For he was so very liberal that his expenses exceeded his incomes, and his generosity was boundless. 23. 3. But before the multitude were made acquainted with Agrippa's being expired, Herod the king of Chalcis, and Helcias the master of his horse, and the king's friend, sent Aristo, one of the king's most faithful servants, and slew Silas, who had been their enemy, as if it had been done by the king's own command. Chapter 9. What things were done after the death of Agrippa, and how Claudius, on account of the youth and unskillfulness of Agrippa, Jr., sent Cuspius Fadus to be procurator of Judea, and of the entire kingdom 1. And thus did King Agrippa depart this life. But he left behind him a son, Agrippa by name, a youth in the 17th year of his age, and 3 daughters. One of which, Bernice, was married to Herod, his father's brother, and was 16 years old. The other 2, Mariamne and Drusilla, were still virgins. The former was 10 years old, and Drusilla 6. Now these his daughters were thus espoused by their father. Marlatone to Julius Archelaus Epiphanes, the son of Antiochus, the son of Chelcias, and Drusilla to the king of Commagena. But when it was known that Agrippa was departed this life, the inhabitants of Syria and of Sebaste forgot the kindnesses he had bestowed on them, and acted the part of the bitterest enemies. For they cast such reproaches upon the deceased as are not fit to be spoken of. And so many of them as were then soldiers, which were a great number, went to his house, and hastily carried off the statues 24 of this king's daughters, and all at once carried them into the brothel houses, and when they had set them on the tops of those houses, they abused them to the utmost of their power, and did such things to them as are too indecent to be related. They also laid themselves down in public places, and celebrated general feastings, with garlands on their heads, and with ointments and libations to Charon, and drinking to one another for joy that the king was expired. Nay, they were not only unmindful of Agrippa, who had extended his liberality to them in abundance, but of his grandfather Herod also, who had himself rebuilt their cities, and had raised them havens and temples at vast expenses. 2. Now Agrippa, the son of the deceased, was at Rome, and brought up with Claudius Cr. And when Cr was informed that Agrippa was dead, and that the inhabitants of Sebaste and Syria had abused him, he was sorry for the first news, and was displeased with the ingratitude of those cities. He was therefore disposed to send Agrippa, Jr., away presently to succeed his father in the kingdom, and was willing to confirm him in it by his oath. But those freedmen and friends of his, who had the greatest authority with him, dissuaded him from it, and said that it was a dangerous experiment to permit so large a kingdom to come under the government of so very young a man, and one hardly yet arrived at years of discretion, who would not be able to take sufficient care of its administration, while the weight of a kingdom is heavy enough to a grown man. So Cr thought what they said to be reasonable. Accordingly he sent Cuspins Fadus to be procurator of Judea, and of the entire kingdom, and paid that respect to the deceased as not to introduce Marcus, who had been at variance with him, into his kingdom. But he determined, in the first place, to send orders to Fadus, that he should chastise the inhabitants of Syria and Sebaste for those abuses they had offered to him that was deceased, and their madness towards his daughters that were still alive. And that he should remove that body of soldiers that were at Syria and Sebaste, with the 5 regiments, into Pontus, that they might do their military duty there. And that he should choose an equal number of soldiers out of the Roman legions that were in Syria, to supply their place. Yet were not those that had such orders actually removed. For by sending ambassadors to Claudius, they mollified him, and got leave to abide in Judea still. And these were the very men that became the source of very great calamities to the Jews in after times, and sowed the seeds of that war which began under Florus. Whence it was that when Vespasian had subdued the country, he removed them out of his province, as we shall relate hereafter. Footnotes 1. Return in this and the 3 next chapters we have, I think, a larger and more distinct account of the slaughter of Caius, and the succession of Claudius, than we have of any such ancient facts whatsoever elsewhere. Some of the occasions of which probably were Josephus's bitter hatred against tyranny, and the pleasure he took in giving the history of the slaughter of such a barbarous tyrant as was this Caius Caligula, as also the deliverance his own nation had by that slaughter, of which he speaks sect. 2. Together with the great intimacy he had with Agrippa, Jr., whose father was deeply concerned in the advancement of Claudius, upon the death of Caius. From which Agrippa, Jr., Josephus might be fully informed of his history. 2. Return called Caligula by the Romans. 3. Return just such a voice as this is related to became, and from an unknown original also, to the famous Polycarp, as he was going to martyrdom, bidding him play the man. As the Church of Smyrna assures us in their account of that his martyrdom, sect. 9. 4. Return here Josephus supposes that it was Augustus, and not Julius Cr., who first changed the Roman Commonwealth into a monarchy. For these shows were in honor of Augustus, as we shall learn in the next section. 5. Return Suetonius says Caius was slain about the 7th hour of the day, the 9th. The series of the narration favors Josephus. 6. Return the rewards proposed by the Roman laws to informers was sometimes an 8th part as Spanheim assures us, from the criminal's goods, as here, and sometimes a 4th part. 7. Return these consuls are named in the War of the Jews, B.E. ch. 11 sect. 1. Sentius Saturninus and Pomponius Secundus, as Spanheim notes here. The speech of the former of them is set down in the next chapter, sect. 2. 8. Return in this oration of Sentius Saturninus, we may see the great value virtuous men put upon public liberty, and the sad misery they underwent, while they were tyrannized over by such emperors as Caius. See Josephus's own short but pithy reflection at the end of the chapter. So difficult, says he, it is for those to obtain the virtue that is necessary to a wise man, who have the absolute power to do what they please without control. 9. Return hence we learn that, in the opinion of Saturninus, the sovereign authority of the consuls and senate had been taken away just 100 years before the death of Caius, AD 41, or in the 60th year before the Christian saga, when the first triumvirate began under Cr. Pompey and Crassus. 10. Return Spanheim here notes from Suetonius, that the name of Caius's sister with whom he was guilty of incest, was Drusilla, and that Suetonius adds, he was guilty of the same crime with all his sisters also. He notes further, that Suetonius omits the mention of the haven for ships, which our author esteems the only public work for the good of the present and future ages which Caius left behind him, though in an imperfect condition. 11. Return this Caius was the son of that excellent person Germanicus, who was the son of Drusus, the brother of Tiberius the emperor. The first place Claudius came to was inhabited, and called Harincure, as Spanheim here informs us from Suetonius, in Claude ch. 10. 12. Return how Claudius, another son of Drusus, which Drusus was the father of Germanicus, could be here himself called Germanicus, Suetonius informs us, when he assures us that, by a decree of the Senate, the surname of Germanicus was bestowed upon Drusus, and his posterity also. And Claude ch. 1. 13. Return this number of drachmae to be distributed to each private soldier, 5,000 drachmae, equal to 20,000 sesterces, or 161 pounds sterling, seems much too large, and directly contradicts Suetonius, ch. 10, who makes them in all but 15 sesterces, or 2 shillings and 4 pence. Yet might Josephus have this number from Agrippa, Jr., though I doubt the thousands, or at least the hundreds, have been added by the transcribers, of which we have had several examples already in Josephus. 14. Return this piercing cold here complained of by Lupus agrees well to the time of the year when Claudius began his reign. It being for certain about the months of November, December, or January, and most probably a few days after January the 24th, and a few days before the Roman Parentalia. 15. Return it is both here and elsewhere very remarkable, that the murders of the villas tyrants, who yet highly deserved to die, when those murderers were under oaths, or other the like obligations of fidelity to them, were usually revenged, and the murderers were cut off themselves, and that after a remarkable manner. And this sometimes, as in the present case, by those very persons who were not sorry for such murders, but got kingdoms by them. The examples are very numerous, both in sacred and profane histories, and seem generally indications of divine vengeance on such murderers. Nor is it unworthy of remark, that such murderers of tyrants do it usually on such ill principles, in such a cruel manner, and as ready to involve the innocent with the guilty, which was the case here, ch. 1 sect. 14, and ch. 2 sect. 4, as justly deserved the divine vengeance upon them. Which seems to have been the case of Jehu also, when, besides the house of Ahab, for whose slaughter he had a commission from God, without any such commission, any justice or commiseration, he killed Ahab's great men, and acquaintance, and priests, and 42 of the kindred of Ahaziah, 2 Kings 10, 11-14. See Hosea 1-4. I do not mean here to condemn Ehud or Judith, or the like executioners of God's vengeance on those wicked tyrants who had unjustly oppressed God's own people under their theocracy. Who, as they appear still to have had no selfish designs nor intentions to slay the innocent, so had they still a divine commission, or a divine impulse, which was their commission for what they did. Judges 3-15, 19, 20. Judith 9-2. Test. Levi. Sect. 5. Inoffant. Rec. Pages 312. See also page 432. 16. Return here St. Luke is in some measure confirmed, when he reforms us, ch. 3-1, that Lysanias was some time before Tetrarch of Abilene, whose capital was Abila. As he is further confirmed by Ptolemy, The great geographer, which Spanheim here observes, when he calls that city Abila of Lysanias. See the note on Bxvii. Ch. 11 sect. 4. And Prid. At the years 36 and 22. I esteem this principality to have belonged to the land of Canaan originally, to have been the burying place of Abel, and referred to as such, Matthew 23-35. Luke 11-51. See Opent. Rec. Part. II. Pages 883-85. 17. Return. This form was so known and frequent among the Romans, as Dr. Hudson here tells us from the Great Selden, that it used to be thus represented at the bottom of their edicts by the initial letters only, UDPRLP, unda plano rect lege possit. Whence it may be plainly read from the ground. 18. Return. Josephus shows, both here and ch. 7 sect. 3. That he had a much greater opinion of King Agrippa I than Simon the learned rabbi, than the people of Syria and Sebast, ch. 7 sect. 4. And ch. 9 sect. 1. And indeed then his double dealing between the Senate and Claudius, ch. 4 sect. 2. Than his slaughter of James the brother of John, and his imprisonment of Peter, or his vainglorious behavior before he died, both in Acts 12-13. And here, ch. 4 sect. 1. Will justify or allow. Josephus's character was probably taken from his son Agrippa, Jr. 19. Return. This treasury chamber seems to have been the very same in which our Savior taught, and where the people offered their charity money for the repairs or other uses of the temple, Mark 12-41, etc. Luke 22-1. John 8-20. 20. Return. A strange number of condemned criminals to be under the sentence of death at once. No fewer, it seems, than 1,400. 21. Return. We have a mighty cry made here by some critics, as the great Eusebius had on purpose falsified this account of Josephus, so as to make it agree with the parallel account in the Acts of the Apostles, because the present copies of his citation of it, Hist. S. Seals. B.E. Ch. 10, omit the words an owl and a certain rope, which Josephus's present copies retain, and only have the explicatory word or angel. As if he meant that angel of the Lord which St. Luke mentions as smiting Herod, Acts 12-23, and not that owl which Josephus called an angel or messenger, formerly of good, but now of bad news, to Agrippa. This accusation is a somewhat strange one in the case of the great Eusebius, who was known to have so accurately and faithfully produced a vast number of other ancient records, and particularly not a few out of our Josephus also, without any suspicion of prevarication. Now, not to allege how uncertain we are whether Josephus's and Eusebius's copies of the 4th century were just like the present in this clause, which we have no distinct evidence of, the following words, preserved still in Eusebius, will not admit of any such exposition. This bird, says Eusebius, Agrippa presently perceived to be the cause of ill fortune, as it was once of good fortune, to him. Which can only belong to that bird, the owl, which as it had formerly foreboded his happy deliverance from imprisonment, Antic. Bxviich. 6 sect. 7. So was it then foretold to prove afterward the unhappy forerunner of his death in 5 days' time. If the improper words signifying cause, be changed for Josephus's proper word angel or messenger, and the foregoing words, be inserted, Eusebius's text will truly represent that in Josephus. Had this imperfection been in some heathen author that was in good esteem with our modern critics, they would have readily corrected these as barely errors in the copies. But being in an ancient Christian writer, not so well relished by many of those critics, nothing will serve but the ill-grounded supposal of wilful corruption and prevarication. 22. Return. This sum of 12 millions of drachmae, which is equal to 3 millions of shekels, that is at 2s. 10d. A shekel, equal to 425,000 pounds sterling, was Agrippa the Great's yearly income, or about 3/4 of his grandfather Herod's income. He having abated the tax upon houses at Jerusalem, ch. 6 sect. 3, and was not so tyrannical as Herod had been to the Jews. See the note on Antiquities. Ch. 11 sect. 4. A large sum this. But not, it seems, sufficient for his extravagant expenses. 23. Return Relland takes notice here, not improperly, that Josephus omits the reconciliation of this Herod Agrippa to the Tyrians and Sidonians, by the means of Blastus the king's chamberlain, mentioned Acts 12-20. Nor is there any history in the world so complete, as to omit nothing that other historians take notice of, unless the one be taken out of the other, and accommodated to it. 24. Return Photius, who made an extract out of this section, says they were not the statues or images, but the ladies themselves, who were thus basely abused by the soldiers. Book XX. Containing the interval of 22 years. Rom Fadus the Procurator to Florus, Chapter 1. A sedition of the Philadelphians against the Jews. And also concerning the vestments of the high priest. 1. Upon the death of King Agrippa, which we have related in the foregoing book, Claudius Cr sent Cassius Longinus as successor to Marcus, out of regard to the memory of King Agrippa, who had often desired of him by letters, while he was alive, that he would not suffer Marcus to be any longer president of Syria. But Fadus, as soon as he was come procurator into Judea, found quarrelsome doings between the Jews that dwelt in Perea, and the people of Philadelphia, about their borders, at a village called Mea, that was filled with men of a warlike temper. For the Jews of Perea had taken up arms without the consent of their principal men, and had destroyed many of the Philadelphians. When Fadus was informed of this procedure, it provoked him very much that they had not left the determination of the matter to him, if they thought that the Philadelphians had done them any wrong, but had rashly taken up arms against them. So he seized upon 3 of their principal men, who were also the causes of this sedition, and ordered them to be bound, and afterwards had one of them slain, whose name was Hannibal. And he banished the other 2, Aram and Eleazar. Ptolemy also, the arch-robber, was, after some time, brought to him bound, and slain, but not till he had done a world of mischief to Idumea and the Arabians. And indeed, from that time, Judea was cleared of robberies by the care and providence of Fadus. He also at this time sent for the high priests and the principal citizens of Jerusalem, and this at the command of the emperor, and admonished them that they should lay up the long garment and the sacred vestment, which it is customary for nobody but the high priest to wear, in the tower of Antonia, that it might be under the power of the Romans, as it had been formerly. Now the Jews durst not contradict what he had said, but desired Fadus, however, and Longinus, which last was come to Jerusalem, and had brought a great army with him, out of a fear that the rigid injunctions of Fadus should force the Jews to rebel, that they might, in the first place, have leave to send ambassadors to Cr, to petition him that they may have the holy vestments under their own power. And that, in the next place, they would tarry till they knew what answer Claudius would give to that their request. So they replied, that they would give them leave to send their ambassadors, provided they would give them their sons as pledges for their peaceable behavior. And when they had agreed so to do, and had given them the pledges they desired, the ambassadors were sent accordingly. But when, upon their coming to Rome, Agrippa, Jr., the son of the deceased, understood the reason why they came, for he dwelt with Claudius Cr, as we said before, he besought Cr to grant the Jews their request about the holy vestments, and to send a message to Fadus accordingly. 2. Hereupon Claudius called for the ambassadors, and told them that he granted their request, and bade them to return their thanks to Agrippa for this favor, which had been bestowed on them upon his entreaty. And besides these answers of his, he sent the following letter by them: Claudius Cr Germanicus, tribune of the people the 5th time, and designed consul the 4th time, and imperator the 10th time, the father of his country, to the magistrates, senate, and people, and the whole nation of the Jews, sendeth greeting. Upon the presentation of your ambassadors to me by Agrippa, my friend, whom I have brought up, and have now with me, and who is a person of very great piety, who are come to give me thanks for the care I have taken of your nation, and to entreat me, in an earnest and obliging manner, that they may have the holy vestments, with the crown belonging to them, under their power, grant their request, as that excellent person Vitellius, who was very dear to me, had done before me. And I have complied with your desire, in the first place, out of regard to that piety which I profess, and because I would have every one worship God according to the laws of their own country. And this I do also because I shall hereby highly gratify King Herod, and Agrippa, Jr., whose sacred regards to me, and earnest goodwill to you, I am well acquainted with, and with whom I have the greatest friendship, and whom I highly esteem, and look on as persons of the best character. Now I have written about these affairs to Cuspius Fadus, my procurator. The names of those that brought me your letter are Cornelius, the son of Ciro, Trypho, the son of Thudio, Dorotheus, the son of Nathaniel, and John, the son of Joder. This letter is dated before the 4th of the calends of July, when Rufus and Pompeius Silvanus are consuls. 3. Herod also, the brother of the deceased Agrippa, who was then possessed of the royal authority over Chalcis, petitioned Claudius Caesar for the authority over the temple, and the money of the sacred treasure, and the choice of the high priests, and obtained all that he petitioned for. So that after that time this authority continued among all his descendants till the end of the war, when accordingly Herod removed the last high priest, called Symphares, and bestowed that dignity on his successor Joseph, the son of Cantos. Chapter 2. How Helena the queen of Adiabene and her son Isaetes embraced the Jewish religion. And how Helena supplied the poor with corn, when there was a great famine at Jerusalem. 1. About this time it was that Helena, queen of Adiabene, and her son Isaetes, changed their course of life, and embraced the Jewish customs, and this on the occasion following: Manassas, the king of Adiabene, who had also the name of Bazus, fell in love with his sister Helena, and took her to be his wife, and begat her with child. But as he was in bed with her one night, he laid his hand upon his wife's belly, and fell asleep, and seemed to hear a voice, which bid him take his hand off his wife's belly, and not hurt the infant that was therein, which, by God's providence, would be safely born, and have a happy end. This voice put him into disorder. So he awaked immediately, and told the story to his wife. And when his son was born, he called him Isaetes. He had indeed Manassas, his elder brother, by Helena also, as he had other sons by other wives besides. Yet did he openly place all his affections on this his only begotten son Isaetes, which was the origin of that envy which his other brethren, by the same father, bore to him. While on this account they hated him more and more, and were all under great affliction that their father should prefer Isaetes before them. Now although their father was very sensible of these their passions, yet did he forgive them, as not indulging those passions out of an ill disposition, but out of a desire each of them had to be beloved by their father. However, he sent Isaetes, with many presents, to Abennerig, the king of Charax-Spasini, and that out of the great dread he was in about him, lest he should come to some misfortune by the hatred his brethren bore him. And he committed his son's preservation to him. Upon which Abennerig gladly received the young man, and had a great affection for him, and married him to his own daughter, whose name was Samacha. He also bestowed a country upon him, from which he received large revenues. 2. But when Manassas was grown old, and saw that he had but a little time to live, he had a mind to come to the sight of his son before he died. So he sent for him, and embraced him after the most affectionate manner, and bestowed on him the country called Cara. It was a soil that bare momum in great plenty. There are also in it the remains of that ark, wherein it is related that Noah escaped the deluge, and where they are still shown to such as are desirous to see them. 3. Accordingly, Isaetes abode in that country until his father's death. But the very day that Manassas died, Queen Helena sent for all the grandees and governors of the kingdom, and for those that had the armies committed to their command. And when they were come, she made the following speech to them: I believe you are not unacquainted that my husband was desirous Isaetes should succeed him in the government, and thought him worthy so to do. However, I wait your determination. For happy is he who receives a kingdom, not from a single person only, but from the willing suffrages of a great many. This she said, in order to try those that were invited, and to discover their sentiments. Upon the hearing of which, they first of all paid their homage to the queen, as their custom was, and then they said that they confirmed the king's determination, and would submit to it. And they rejoiced that Isaetes' father had preferred him before the rest of his brethren, as being agreeable to all their wishes, but that they were desirous first of all to slay his brethren and kinsmen, that so the government might come securely to Isaetes. Because if they were once destroyed, all that fear would be over which might arise from their hatred and envy to him. Helena replied to this, that she returned them her thanks for their kindness to herself and to Isaetes, but desired that they would however defer the execution of this slaughter of Isaetes' brethren till he should be there himself, and give his approbation to it. So since these men had not prevailed with her, when they advised her to slay them, they exhorted her at least to keep them in bonds till he should come, and that for their own security. They also gave her counsel to set up some one whom she could put the greatest trust in, as a governor of the kingdom in the meantime. So Queen Helena complied with this counsel of theirs, and set up Manassas, the eldest son, to be king, and put the diadem upon his head, and gave him his father's ring, with its signet, as also the ornament which they call Samsar, and exhorted him to administer the affairs of the kingdom till his brother should come, who came suddenly upon hearing that his father was dead, and succeeded his brother Manassas, who resigned up the government to him. 3. Now, during the time Isaetes abode at Charaxpasini, a certain Jewish merchant, whose name was Ananias, got among the women that belonged to the king, and taught them to worship God according to the Jewish religion. He, moreover, by their means, became known to Isaetes, and persuaded him, in like manner, to embrace that religion. He also, at the earnest entreaty of Isaetes, accompanied him when he was sent for by his father to come to Adiabene. It also happened that Helena, about the same time, was instructed by a certain other Jew and went over to them. But when Isaetes had taken the kingdom, and was come to Adiabene, and there saw his brethren and other kinsmen in bonds, he was displeased at it. And as he thought it an instance of impiety either to slay or imprison them, but still thought it a hazardous thing for to let them have their liberty, with the remembrance of the injuries that had been offered them, he sent some of them and their children for hostages to Rome, to Claudius Cr., and sent the others to Artabanus, the king of Parthia, with the like intentions. 4. And when he perceived that his mother was highly pleased with the Jewish customs, he made haste to change, and to embrace them entirely. And as he supposed that he could not be thoroughly a Jew unless he was circumcised, he was ready to have it done. But when his mother understood what he was about, she endeavored to hinder him from doing it, and said to him that this thing would bring him into danger, and that, as he was a king, he would thereby bring himself into great odium among his subjects, when they should understand that he was so fond of rites that were to them strange and foreign, and that they would never bear to be ruled over by a Jew. This it was that she said to him, and for the present persuaded him to forbear. And when he had related what she had said to Ananias, he confirmed what his mother had said. And when he had also threatened to leave him, unless he complied with him, he went away from him, and said that he was afraid lest such an action being once become public to all, he should himself be in danger of punishment for having been the occasion of it, and having been the king's instructor in actions that were of ill reputation. And he said that he might worship God without being circumcised, even though he did resolve to follow the Jewish law entirely, which worship of God was of a superior nature to circumcision. He added, that God would forgive him, though he did not perform the operation, while it was omitted out of necessity, and for fear of his subjects. So the king at that time complied with these persuasions of Ananias. But afterwards, as he had not quite left off his desire of doing this thing, a certain other Jew that came out of Galilee, whose name was Eliezer, and who was esteemed very skillful in the learning of his country, persuaded him to do the thing. For as he entered into his palace to salute him, and found him reading the law of Moses, he said to him, Thou dost not consider, O king, that thou unjustly breakest the principle of those laws, and art injurious to God himself, by omitting to be circumcised. For thou oughtest not only to read them, but chiefly to practice what they enjoin thee. How long wilt thou continue uncircumcised? But if thou hast not yet read the law about circumcision, and dost not know how great impiety thou art guilty of by neglecting it, read it now. When the king had heard what he said, he delayed the thing no longer, but retired to another room, and sent for a surgeon, and did what he was commanded to do. He then sent for his mother, and Ananias his tutor, and informed them that he had done the thing. Upon which they were presently struck with astonishment and fear, and that to a great degree, lest the thing should be openly discovered and censured, and the king should hazard the loss of his kingdom, while his subjects would not bear to be governed by a man who was so zealous in another religion. And lest they should themselves run some hazard, because they would be supposed the occasion of his so doing. But it was God himself who hindered what they feared from taking effect. For he preserved both Isaac himself and his sons when they fell into many dangers, and procured their deliverance when it seemed to be impossible, and demonstrated thereby that the fruit of piety does not perish as to those that have regard to him, and fix their faith upon him only. But these events we shall relate hereafter. 5. But as to Helena, the king's mother, when she saw that the affairs of Isaac's kingdom were in peace, and that her son was a happy man, and admired among all men, and even among foreigners, by the means of God's providence over him, she had a mind to go to the city of Jerusalem, in order to worship at that temple of God which was so very famous among all men, and to offer her thank offerings there. So she desired her son to give her leave to go thither. Upon which he gave his consent to what she desired very willingly, and made great preparations for her dismission, and gave her a great deal of money, and she went down to the city Jerusalem, her son conducting her on her journey a great way. Now her coming was of very great advantage to the people of Jerusalem. For whereas a famine did oppress them at that time, and many people died for want of what was necessary to procure food withal, Queen Helena sent some of her servants to Alexandria with money to buy a great quantity of corn, and others of them to Cyprus, to bring a cargo of dried figs. And as soon as they were come back, and had brought those provisions, which was done very quickly, she distributed food to those that were in want of it, and left a most excellent memorial behind her of this benefaction, which she bestowed on our whole nation. And when her son Isaac was informed of this famine, he sent great sums of money to the principal men in Jerusalem. However, what favors this queen and king conferred upon our city Jerusalem shall be further related hereafter. Chapter 3. How Artabanus, the king of Parthia, out of fear of the secret contrivances of his subjects against him, went to Isaac, and was by him reinstated in his government. As also how Bardanes his son denounced war against Isaac. 1. But now Artabanus, king of the Parthians, perceiving that the governors of the provinces had framed a plot against him, did not think it safe for him to continue among them, but resolved to go to Isaac, in hopes of finding some way for his preservation by his means, and, if possible, for his return to his own dominions. So he came to Isaac, and brought 1,000 of his kindred and servants with him, and met him upon the road, while he well knew Isaac, but Isaac did not know him. When Artabanus stood near him, and, in the first place, worshipped him, according to the custom, he then said to him, O king, do not thou overlook me thy servant, nor do thou proudly reject the suit I make thee. For as I am reduced to a low estate, by the change of fortune, and of a king am become a private man, I stand in need of thy assistance. Have regard, Therefore, unto the uncertainty of fortune, and esteem the care thou shalt take of me to be taken of thyself also. For if I be neglected, and my subjects go off unpunished, many other subjects will become the more insolent towards other kings also. And this speech Artabanus made with tears in his eyes, and with a dejected countenance. Now as soon as Isaetes heard Artabanus's name, and saw him stand as a supplicant before him, he leaped down from his horse immediately, and said to him, Take courage, O king! Nor be disturbed at thy present calamity, as if it were incurable. For the change of thy sad condition shall be sudden. For thou shalt find me to be more thy friend and thy assistant than thy hopes can promise thee. For I will either re-establish thee in the kingdom of Parthia, or lose my own. 2. When he had said this, he set Artabanus upon his horse, and followed him on foot, in honor of a king whom he owned as greater than himself. Which, when Artabanus saw, he was very uneasy at it, and sware by his present fortune and honor that he would get down from his horse, unless Isaetes would get upon his horse again, and go before him. So he complied with his desire, and leaped upon his horse. And when he had brought him to his royal palace, he showed him all sorts of respect when they sat together, and he gave him the upper place at festivals also, as regarding not his present fortune, but his former dignity, and that upon this consideration also, that the changes of fortune are common to all men. He also wrote to the Parthians, to persuade them to receive Artabanus again, and gave them his right hand and his faith, that he should forget what was past and done, and that he would undertake for this as a mediator between them. Now the Parthians did not themselves refuse to receive him again, but pleaded that it was not now in their power so to do, because they had committed the government to another person, who had accepted of it, and whose name was Cinemus, and that they were afraid lest a civil war should arise on this account. When Cinemus understood their intentions, he wrote to Artabanus himself, for he had been brought up by him, and was of a nature good and gentle also, and desired him to put confidence in him, and to come and take his own dominions again. Accordingly, Artabanus trusted him, and returned home. When Cinemus met him, worshipped him, and saluted him as a king, and took the diadem off his own head, and put it on the head of Artabanus. 3. And thus was Artabanus restored to his kingdom again by the means of Isaetes, when he had lost it by the means of the grandees of the kingdom. Nor was he unmindful of the benefits he had conferred upon him, but rewarded him with such honors as were of the greatest esteem among them. For he gave him leave to wear his tiara upright, 6 and to sleep upon a golden bed, which are privileges and marks of honor peculiar to the kings of Parthia. He also cut off a large and fruitful country from the king of Armenia, and bestowed it upon him. The name of the country is Nisibis, wherein the Macedonians had formerly built that city which they called Antioch of Mygodonia. And these were the honors that were paid Isaetes by the king of the Parthians. 4. But in no long time Artabanus died, and left his kingdom to his son Bardanes. Now this Bardanes came to Isaetes, and would have persuaded him to join him with his army, and to assist him in the war he was preparing to make with the Romans. But he could not prevail with him. For Isaetes so well knew the strength and good fortune of the Romans, that he took Bardanes to attempt what was impossible to be done. And having besides sent his sons, 5 in number, and they but young also, to learn accurately the language of our nation, together with our learning, as well as he had sent his mother to worship at our temple, as I have said already, was the more backward to a compliance. And restrained Bardanes, telling him perpetually of the great armies and famous actions of the Romans, and thought thereby to terrify him, and desired thereby to hinder him from that expedition. But the Parthian king was provoked at this his behavior, and denounced war immediately against Isaetes. Yet did he gain no advantage by this war, because God cut off all his hopes therein. For the Parthians perceiving Bardanes' intentions, and how he had determined to make war with the Romans, slew him, and gave his kingdom to his brother Godarzes. He also, in no long time, perished by a plot made against him, and Vologeses, his brother, succeeded him, who committed 2 of his provinces to 2 of his brothers by the same father. That of the Medes to the elder, Pacorus, and Armenia to the younger, Tiridates. Chapter 4. How Isaetes was betrayed by his own subjects, and fought against by the Arabians, and how Isaetes, by the providence of God, was delivered out of their hands. 1. Now when the king's brother, Manasseh, and his other kindred, saw how Isaetes, by his piety to God, was become greatly esteemed by all men, they also had a desire to leave the religion of their country, and to embrace the customs of the Jews. But that act of theirs was discovered by Isaetes' subjects. Whereupon the grandees were much displeased, and could not contain their anger at them, but had an intention, when they should find a proper opportunity, to inflict a punishment upon them. Accordingly, they wrote to Abia, king of the Arabians, and promised him great sums of money, if he would make an expedition against their king. And they further promised him, that, on the first onset, they would desert their king, because they were desirous to punish him, by reason of the hatred he had to their religious worship. Then they obliged themselves, by oaths, to be faithful to each other, and desired that he would make haste in this design. The king of Arabia complied with their desires, and brought a great army into the field, and marched against Isaetes. And, in the beginning of the first onset, and before they came to a close fight, those grandees, as if they had a panic terror upon them, all deserted Isaetes, as they had agreed to do, and, turning their backs upon their enemies, ran away. Yet was not Isaetes dismayed at this. But when he understood that the grandees had betrayed him, he also retired into his camp, and made inquiry into the matter. And as soon as he knew who they were that made this conspiracy with the king of Arabia, he cut off those that were found guilty. And renewing the fight on the next day, he slew the greatest part of his enemies, and forced all the rest to betake themselves to flight. He also pursued their king, and drove him into a fortress called Arsamas, and following on the siege vigorously, he took that fortress. And when he had plundered it of all the prey that was in it, which was not small, he returned to Adiabene. Yet did not he take Abia alive, because, when he found himself encompassed on every side, he slew himself. 2. But although the grandees of Adiabene had failed in their first attempt, as being delivered up by God into their king's hands, yet would they not even then be quiet, but wrote again to Vologases, who was then king of Parthia, and desired that he would kill Isaetes, and set over them some other potentate, who should be of a Parthian family. For they said that they hated their own king for abrogating the laws of their forefathers, and embracing foreign customs. When the king of Parthia heard this, he boldly made war upon Isaetes. And as he had no just pretense for this war, he sent to him, and demanded back those honorable privileges which had been bestowed on him by his father, and threatened, on his refusal, to make war upon him. Upon hearing of this, Isaetes was under no small trouble of mind, as thinking it would be a reproach upon him to appear to resign those privileges that had been bestowed upon him out of cowardice. Yet because he knew, that though the king of Parthia should receive back those honors, yet would he not be quiet, he resolved to commit himself to God, his protector, in the present danger he was in of his life. And as he esteemed him to be his principal assistant, he entrusted his children and his wives to a very strong fortress, and laid up his corn in its citadels, and set the hay and the grass on fire. And when he had thus put things in order, as well as he could, he awaited the coming of the enemy. And when the king of Parthia was come, with a great army of footmen and horsemen, which he did sooner than was expected, for he marched in great haste, and had cast up a bank at the river that parted Adiabene from Media, Isaetes also pitched his camp not far off, having with him 6,000 horsemen. But there came a messenger to Isaetes, sent by the king of Parthia, who told him how large his dominions were, as reaching from the river Euphrates to Bactria, and enumerated that king's subjects. He also threatened him that he should be punished, as a person ungrateful to his lords, and said that the God whom he worshipped could not deliver him out of the king's hands. When the messenger had delivered this his message, Isaetes replied that he knew the king of Parthia's power was much greater than his own, but that he knew also that God was much more powerful than all men. And when he had returned him this answer, he betook himself to make supplication to God, and threw himself upon the ground, and put ashes upon his head, in testimony of his confusion, and fasted, together with his wives and children. 7 Then he called upon God, and said, O Lord and Governor, if I have not in vain committed myself to thy goodness, but have justly determined that thou only art the Lord and principal of all beings, come now to my assistance, and defend me from my enemies, not only on my own account, but on account of their insolent behavior with regard to thy power, while they have not feared to lift up their proud and arrogant tongue against thee. Thus did he lament and bemoan himself, with tears in his eyes. Whereupon God heard his prayer. And immediately that very night Vologases received letters, the contents of which were these, that a great band of Dahan Sacs, despising him, now he was gone so long a journey from home, had made an expedition, and laid Parthia waste, so that he was forced to retire back, without doing anything. And thus it was that Isaetes escaped the threatenings of the Parthians, by the providence of God. 3. It was not long ere Isaetes died, when he had completed 55 years of his life, and had ruled his kingdom 24 years. He left behind him 24 sons and 24 daughters. However, he gave order that his brother Manasseh should succeed in the government, thereby requiting him, because, while he was himself absent after their father's death, he had faithfully preserved the government for him. But when Helena, his mother, heard of her son's death, she was in great heaviness, as was but natural, upon her loss of such a most dutiful son. Yet was it a comfort to her that she heard the succession came to her eldest son. Accordingly, she went to him in haste. And when she was come into Adiabene, she did not long outlive her son Isaetes. But Manasseh sent her bones, as well as those of Isaetes, his brother, to Jerusalem, and gave order that they should be buried at the pyramids 8 which their mother had erected. They were 3 in number, and distant no more than 3 furlongs from the city Jerusalem. But for the actions of Manasseh the king, which he did during the rest of his life, we will relate them hereafter. Chapter 5. Concerning Judas and the sons of Judas the Galilean. As also what calamity fell upon the Jews on the day of the Passover. 1. Now it came to pass, while Fadus was procurator of Judea, that a certain magician, whose name was Judas, 9 persuaded a great part of the people to take their effects with them, and follow him to the river Jordan. For he told them he was a prophet, and that he would, by his own command, divide the river, and afford them an easy passage over it. And many were deluded by his words. However, Fadus did not permit them to make any advantage of his wild attempt, but sent a troop of horsemen out against them, who, falling upon them unexpectedly, slew many of them, and took many of them alive. They also took Judas alive, and cut off his head, and carried it to Jerusalem. This was what befell the Jews in the time of Cuspius Fadus's government. 2. Then came Tiberius Alexander as successor to Fadus. He was the son of Alexander the Alabarch of Alexandria, which Alexander was a principal person among all his contemporaries, both for his family and wealth. He was also more eminent for his piety than this his son Alexander, for he did not continue in the religion of his country. Under these procurators that great famine happened in Judea, in which Queen Helena bought corn in Egypt at a great expense, and distributed it to those that were in want, as I have related already. And besides this, the sons of Judas of Galilee were now slain. I mean of that Judas who caused the people to revolt, when Cyrenius came to take an account of the estates of the Jews, as we have showed in a foregoing book. The names of those sons were James and Simon, whom Alexander commanded to be crucified. But now Herod, king of Chalcis, removed Joseph, the son of Camillus, from the high priesthood, and made Ananias, the son of Nebadah, his successor. And now it was that Cumanus came as successor to Tiberius Alexander. As also that Herod, brother of Agrippa the great king, departed this life, in the 8th year of the reign of Claudius Cr. He left behind him 3 sons. Aristobulus, whom he had by his first wife, with Bernicianus, and Hyrcanus, both whom he had by Bernice his brother's daughter. But Claudius Cr. bestowed his dominions on Agrippa, Jr. 3. Now while the Jewish affairs were under the administration of Cumanus, there happened a great tumult at the city of Jerusalem, and many of the Jews perished therein. But I shall first explain the occasion whence it was derived. When that feast which is called the Passover was at hand, at which time our custom is to use unleavened bread, and a great multitude was gathered together from all parts to that feast, Cumanus was afraid lest some attempt of innovation should then be made by them. So he ordered that one regiment of the army should take their arms, and stand in the temple cloisters, to repress any attempts of innovation, if perchance any such should begin. And this was no more than what the former procurators of Judea did at such festivals. But on the 4th day of the feast, a certain soldier let down his breeches, and exposed his privy members to the multitude, which put those that saw him into a furious rage, and made them cry out that this impious action was not done to approach them, but God himself. Nay, some of them reproached Cumanus, and pretended that the soldier was set on by him, which, when Cumanus heard, he was also himself not a little provoked at such reproaches laid upon him. Yet did he exhort them to leave off such seditious attempts, and not to raise a tumult at the festival. But when he could not induce them to be quiet, for they still went on in their reproaches to him, he gave order that the whole army should take their entire armor, and come to Antonia, which was a fortress, as we have said already, which overlooked the temple. But when the multitude saw the soldiers there, they were affrighted at them, and ran away hastily. But as the passages out were but narrow, and as they thought their enemies followed them, they were crowded together in their flight, and a great number were pressed to death in those narrow passages. Nor indeed was the number fewer than 20,000 that perished in this tumult. So instead of a festival, they had at last a mournful day of it. And they all of them forgot their prayers and sacrifices, and betook themselves to lamentation and weeping. So great an affliction did the impudent obsceneness of a single soldier bring upon them. 10. 4. Now before this their first mourning was over, another mischief befell them also. For some of those that raised the foregoing tumult, when they were traveling along the public road, about 100 furlongs from the city, robbed Stephanus, a servant of Cr, as he was journeying, and plundered him of all that he had with him. Which things when Cumanus heard of, he sent soldiers immediately, and ordered them to plunder the neighboring villages, and to bring the most eminent persons among them in bonds to him. Now as this devastation was making, one of the soldiers seized the laws of Moses that lay in one of those villages, and brought them out before the eyes of all present, and tore them to pieces. And this was done with reproachful language, and much scurrility. Which things when the Jews heard of, they ran together, and that in great numbers, and came down to Caesarea, where Cumanus then was, and besought him that he would avenge, not themselves, but God himself, whose laws had been affronted. For that they could not bear to live any longer, if the laws of their forefathers must be affronted after this manner. Accordingly Cumanus, out of fear lest the multitude should go into a sedition, and by the advice of his friends also, took care that the soldier who had offered the affront to the laws should be beheaded, and thereby put a stop to the sedition which was ready to be kindled a second time. Chapter 6. How there happened a quarrel between the Jews and the Samaritans, and how Claudius put an end to their differences. 1. Now there arose a quarrel between the Samaritans and the Jews on the occasion following. It was the custom of the Galileans, when they came to the holy city at the festivals, to take their journeys through the country of the Samaritans. 11. And at this time there lay, in the road they took, a village that was called Ginia, which was situated in the limits of Samaria and the great plain, where certain persons thereto belonging fought with the Galileans, and killed a great many of them. But when the principal of the Galileans were informed of what had been done, they came to Cumanus, and desired him to avenge the murder of those that were killed. but he was induced by the Samaritans, with money, to do nothing in the matter. Upon which the Galileans were much displeased, and persuaded the multitude of the Jews to betake themselves to arms, and to regain their liberty, saying that slavery was in itself a bitter thing, but that when it was joined with direct injuries, it was perfectly intolerable. And when their principal men endeavored to pacify them, and promised to endeavor to persuade Cumanus to avenge those that were killed, they would not hearken to them, but took their weapons, and entreated the assistance of Eleazar, the son of Dineus, a robber, who had many years made his abode in the mountains, with which assistance they plundered many villages of the Samaritans. When Cumanus heard of this action of theirs, he took the band of Sebast, with 4 regiments of footmen, and armed the Samaritans, and marched out against the Jews, and caught them, and slew many of them, and took a great number of them alive. Whereupon those that were the most eminent persons at Jerusalem, and that both in regard to the respect that was paid them, and the families they were of, as soon as they saw to what a height things were gone, put on sackcloth, and heaped ashes upon their heads, and by all possible means besought the seditious, and persuaded them that they would set before their eyes the utter subversion of their country, the conflagration of their temple, and the slavery of themselves, their wives, and children, 12 which would be the consequences of what they were doing, and would alter their minds, would cast away their weapons, and for the future be quiet, and return to their own homes. These persuasions of theirs prevailed upon them. So the people dispersed themselves, and the robbers went away again to their places of strength. And after this time all Judea was overrun with robberies. 2. But the principal of the Samaritans went to Ammidius Quadratus, the president of Syria, who at that time was at Tyre, and accused the Jews of setting their villages on fire, and plundering them. And said withal, that they were not so much displeased at what they had suffered, as they were at the contempt thereby showed the Romans. While if they had received any injury, they ought to have made them the judges of what had been done, and not presently to make such devastation, as if they had not the Romans for their governors. On which account they came to him, in order to obtain that vengeance they wanted. This was the accusation which the Samaritans brought against the Jews. But the Jews affirmed that the Samaritans were the authors of this tumult and fighting, and that, in the first place, Cumanus had been corrupted by their gifts, and passed over the murder of those that were slain in silence. Which allegations when Quadratus heard, he put off the hearing of the cause, and promised that he would give sentence when he should come into Judea, and should have a more exact knowledge of the truth of that matter. So these men went away without success. Yet was it not long ere Quadratus came to Samaria, where, upon hearing the cause, he supposed that the Samaritans were the authors of that disturbance. But when he was informed that certain of the Jews were making innovations, he ordered those to be crucified whom Cumanus had taken captives. From whence he came to a certain village called Lydda, which was not less than a city in largeness, and there heard the Samaritan cause a second time before his tribunal, and there learnt from a certain Samaritan that one of the chief of the Jews, whose name was Dorcas, and some other innovators with him, 4 in number, persuaded the multitude to a revolt from the Romans, whom Quadratus ordered to be put to death, but still he sent away Ananias the high priest, and Ananus the commander of the temple, in bonds to Rome, to give an account of what they had done to Claudius Cr. He also ordered the principal men, both of the Samaritans and of the Jews, as also Cumanus the procurator, and Celer the tribune, to go to Italy to the emperor, that he might hear their cause, and determine their differences one with another. But he came again to the city of Jerusalem, out of his fear that the multitude of the Jews should attempt some innovations. But he found the city in a peaceable state, and celebrating one of the usual festivals of their country to God. So he believed that they would not attempt any innovations, and left them at the celebration of the festival, and returned to Antioch. 3. Now Cumanus, and the principal of the Samaritans, who were sent to Rome, had a day appointed them by the emperor whereon they were to have pleaded their cause about the quarrels they had one with another. But now Cr's freedmen and his friends were very zealous on the behalf of Cumanus and the Samaritans. and they had prevailed over the Jews, unless Agrippa, Jr., who was then at Rome, had seen the principle of the Jews hard set, and had earnestly entreated Agrippina, the emperor's wife, to persuade her husband to hear the cause, so as was agreeable to his justice, and to condemn those to be punished who were really the authors of this revolt from the Roman government. Hereupon Claudius was so well disposed beforehand, that when he had heard the cause, and found that the Samaritans had been the ringleaders in those mischievous doings, he gave order that those who came up to him should be slain, and that Cumanus should be banished. He also gave order that Sulla the tribune should be carried back to Jerusalem, and should be drawn through the city in the sight of all the people, and then should be slain. Chapter 7. Felix is made procurator of Judea. As also concerning Agrippa, Jr. and his sisters 1. So Claudius sent Felix, the brother of Pallas, to take care of the affairs of Judea. And when he had already completed the 12th year of his reign, he bestowed upon Agrippa the tetrarchy of Philip and Batanea, and added thereto Trachonites, with Abila, which last had been the tetrarchy of Lysanias. But he took from him Chalcis, when he had been governor thereof 4 years. And when Agrippa had received these countries as the gift of Cr, he gave his sister Drusilla in marriage to Azizus, king of Emesa, upon his consent to be circumcised. For Epiphanes, the son of King Antiochus, had refused to marry her, because, after he had promised her father formerly to come over to the Jewish religion, he would not now perform that promise. He also gave Mariamne in marriage to Archelaus, the son of Helcias, to whom she had formerly been betrothed by Agrippa her father, from which marriage was derived a daughter, whose name was Bernice. 2. But for the marriage of Drusilla with Azizus, it was in no long time afterward dissolved upon the following occasion. While Felix was procurator of Judea, he saw this Drusilla, and fell in love with her. For she did indeed exceed all other women in beauty. And he sent to her a person whose name was Simon 13, one of his friends. A Jew he was, and by birth a Cypriot, and one who pretended to be a magician, and endeavored to persuade her to forsake her present husband, and marry him. And promised, that if she would not refuse him, he would make her a happy woman. Accordingly she acted ill, and because she was desirous to avoid her sister Bernice's envy, for she was very ill treated by her on account of her beauty, was prevailed upon to transgress the laws of her forefathers, and to marry Felix. And when he had had a son by her, he named him Agrippa. But after what manner that young man, with his wife, perished at the conflagration of the mountain Vesuvius, 14 in the days of Titus Cr, shall be related hereafter. 15. 3. But as for Bernice, she lived a widow a long while after the death of Herod king of Chalcis, who was both her husband and her uncle. But when the report went that she had criminal conversation with her brother, Agrippa, Jr., she persuaded Ptolemy, who was king of Cilicia, to be circumcised, and to marry her, as supposing that by this means she should prove those calumnies upon her to be false. And Ptolemy was prevailed upon, and that chiefly on account of her riches. Yet did not this matrimony endure long. But Bernice left Ptolemy, and, as was said, with impure intentions. So he forsook at once this matrimony, and the Jewish religion. And, at the same time, Mariamne put away Archelaus, and was married to Demetrius, the principal man among the Alexandrian Jews, both for his family and his wealth. And indeed he was then their labarch. So she named her son whom she had by him Agrippinus. But of all these particulars we shall hereafter treat more exactly. 16. Chapter 8. After what manner upon the death of Claudius, Nero succeeded in the government. As also what barbarous things he did. Concerning the robbers, murderers and impostors, that arose while Felix and Festus were procurators of Judea. 1. Now Claudius Cr died when he had reigned 13 years, 8 months, and 20 days. 17 And a report went about that he was poisoned by his wife Agrippina. Her father was Germanicus, the brother of Cr. Her husband was Domitius Enobarbus, one of the most illustrious persons that was in the city of Rome. After whose death, and her long continuance in widowhood, Claudius took her to wife. She brought along with her a son, Domitius, of the same name with his father. He had before this slain his wife Messalina, out of jealousy, by whom he had his children Britannicus and Octavia. Their eldest sister was Antonia, whom he had by Paulina his first wife. He also married Octavia to Nero, for that was the name that Cr gave him afterward, upon his adopting him for his son. 2. But now Agrippina was afraid, lest, when Britannicus should come to man's estate, he should succeed his father in the government, and desired to seize upon the principality beforehand for her own son Nero. Upon which the report went that she thence compassed the death of Claudius. Accordingly, she sent Burrus, the general of the army, immediately, and with him the tribunes, and such also of the freedmen as were of the greatest authority, to bring Nero away into the camp, and to salute him emperor. And when Nero had thus obtained the government, he got Britannicus to be so poisoned, that the multitude should not perceive it. Although he publicly put his own mother to death not long afterward, making her this requital, not only for being born of her, but for bringing it so about by her contrivances that he obtained the Roman Empire. He also slew Octavia his own wife, and many other illustrious persons, under this pretense, that they plotted against him. 3. But I omit any further discourse about these affairs. For there have been a great many who have composed the history of Nero, some of which have departed from the truth of facts out of favor, as having received benefits from him, while others, out of hatred to him, and the great ill will which they bear him, have so impudently raved against him with their lies, that they justly deserve to be condemned. Nor do I wonder at such as have told lies of Nero, since they have not in their writings preserved the truth of history as to those facts that were earlier than his time, even when the actors could have no way incurred their hatred, since those writers lived a long time after them. But as to those that have no regard to truth, they may write as they please, for in that they take delight. But as to ourselves, who have made truth our direct aim, we shall briefly touch upon what only belongs remotely to this undertaking, but shall relate what hath happened to us Jews with great accuracy, and shall not grudge our pains in giving an account both of the calamities we have suffered, and of the crimes we have been guilty of. I will now therefore return to the relation of our own affairs. 4. For in the first year of the reign of Nero, upon the death of Azizus, king of Emesa, Somus, his brother, succeeded in his kingdom, and Aristobulus, the son of Herod, king of Chalcis, was entrusted by Nero with the government of the Lesser Armenia. Cr also bestowed on Agrippa a certain part of Galilee, Tiberias, and Taricae, 18, and ordered them to submit to his jurisdiction. He gave him also Julias, a city of Perea, with 14 villages that lay about it. 5. Now as for the affairs of the Jews, they grew worse and worse continually, for the country was again filled with robbers and impostors, who deluded the multitude. Yet did Felix catch and put to death many of those impostors every day, together with the robbers. He also caught Eleazar, the son of Dineas, who had gotten together a company of robbers. And this he did by treachery. For he gave him assurance that he should suffer no harm, and thereby persuaded him to come to him. But when he came, he bound him, and sent him to Rome. Felix also bore an ill will to Jonathan, the high priest, because he frequently gave him admonitions about governing the Jewish affairs better than he did, lest he should himself have complaints made of him by the multitude, since he it was who had desired Cr to send him as procurator of Judea. So Felix contrived a method whereby he might get rid of him, now he was become so continually troublesome to him. For such continual admonitions are grievous to those who are disposed to act unjustly. Wherefore Felix persuaded one of Jonathan's most faithful friends, a citizen of Jerusalem, whose name was Doras, to bring the robbers upon Jonathan, in order to kill him. And this he did by promising to give him a great deal of money for so doing. Doras complied with the proposal, and contrived matters so, that the robbers might murder him after the following manner. certain of those robbers went up to the city, as if they were going to worship God, while they had daggers under their garments, and by thus mingling themselves among the multitude they slew Jonathan 19. And as this murder was never avenged, the robbers went up with the greatest security at the festivals after this time. And having weapons concealed in like manner as before, and mingling themselves among the multitude, they slew certain of their own enemies, and were subservient to other men for money. And slew others, not only in remote parts of the city, but in the temple itself also. For they had the boldness to murder men there, without thinking of the impiety of which they were guilty. And this seems to me to have been the reason why God, out of his hatred of these men's wickedness, rejected our city. And as for the temple, he no longer esteemed it sufficiently pure for him to inhabit therein, but brought the Romans upon us, and threw a fire upon the city to purge it. And brought upon us, our wives, and children, slavery, as desirous to make us wiser by our calamities. 6. These works, that were done by the robbers, filled the city with all sorts of impiety. And now these impostors and deceivers persuaded the multitude to follow them into the wilderness, and pretended that they would exhibit manifest wonders and signs, that should be performed by the providence of God. And many that were prevailed on by them suffered the punishments of their folly. For Felix brought them back, and then punished them. Moreover, there came out of Egypt 20 about this time to Jerusalem one that said he was a prophet, and advised the multitude of the common people to go along with him to the Mount of Olives, as it was called, which lay over against the city, and at the distance of 5 furlongs. He said further, that he would show them from hence how, at his command, the walls of Jerusalem would fall down. And he promised them that he would procure them an entrance into the city through those walls, when they were fallen down. Now when Felix was informed of these things, he ordered his soldiers to take their weapons, and came against them with a great number of horsemen and footmen from Jerusalem, and attacked the Egyptian and the people that were with him. He also slew 400 of them, and took 200 alive. But the Egyptian himself escaped out of the fight, but did not appear any more. And again the robbers stirred up the people to make war with the Romans, and said they ought not to obey them at all. And when any persons would not comply with them, they set fire to their villages, and plundered them. 7. And now it was that a great sedition arose between the Jews that inhabited Syria, and the Syrians who dwelt there also, concerning their equal right to the privileges belonging to citizens. For the Jews claimed the preeminence, because Herod their king was the builder of Syria, and because he was by birth a Jew. Now the Syrians did not deny what was alleged about Herod. But they said that Syria was formerly called Strato's Tower, and that then there was not one Jewish inhabitant. When the presidents of that country heard of these disorders, they caught the authors of them on both sides, and tormented them with stripes, and by that means put a stop to the disturbance for a time. But the Jewish citizens, depending on their wealth, and on that account despising the Syrians, reproached them again, and hoped to provoke them by such reproaches. However, the Syrians, though they were inferior in wealth, yet valuing themselves highly on this account, that the greatest part of the Roman soldiers that were there were either of Syria or Sebast, they also for some time used reproachful language to the Jews also. And thus it was, till at length they came to throwing stones at one another, and several were wounded, and fell on both sides, though still the Jews were the conquerors. But when Felix saw that this quarrel was become a kind of war, he came upon them on the sudden, and desired the Jews to desist. And when they refused so to do, he armed his soldiers, and sent them out upon them, and slew many of them, and took more of them alive, and permitted his soldiers to plunder some of the houses of the citizens, which were full of riches. Now those Jews that were more moderate, and of principal dignity among them, were afraid of themselves, and desired of Felix that he would sound a retreat to his soldiers, and spare them for the future, and afford them room for repentance for what they had done. And Felix was prevailed upon to do so. 8. About this time King Agrippa gave the high priesthood to Ismail, who was the son of Phabi. And now arose a sedition between the high priests and the principal men of the multitude of Jerusalem, each of which got them a company of the boldest sort of men, and of those that loved innovations about them, and became leaders to them. And when they struggled together, they did it by casting reproachful words against one another, and by throwing stones also. And there was nobody to reprove them. But these disorders were done after a licentious manner in the city, as if it had no government over it. And such was the impudence 21 and boldness that had seized on the high priests, that they had the hardiness to send their servants into the threshing floors, to take away those tithes that were due to the priests, insomuch that it so fell out that the poorest sort of the priests died for want. To this degree did the violence of the seditious prevail over all right and justice. 9. Now when Porcius Festus was sent as successor to Felix by Nero, the principal of the Jewish inhabitants of Syria went up to Rome to accuse Felix. And he had certainly been brought to punishment, unless Nero had yielded to the importunate solicitations of his brother Pallas, who was at that time had in the greatest honor by him. Two of the principal Syrians in Syria persuaded Burrus, who was Nero's tutor, and secretary for his Greek epistles, by giving him a great sum of money, to disannul that equality of the Jewish privileges of citizens which they hitherto enjoyed. So Burrus, by his solicitations, obtained leave of the emperor that an epistle should be written to that purpose. This epistle became the occasion of the following miseries that befell our nation. For when the Jews of Syria were informed of the contents of this epistle to the Syrians, they were more disorderly than before, till a war was kindled. 10. Upon Festus's coming into Judea, it happened that Judea was afflicted by the robbers, while all the villages were set on fire, and plundered by them. And then it was that the Sicarii, as they were called, who were robbers, grew numerous. They made use of small swords, not much different in length from the Persian asnasi, but somewhat crooked, and like the Roman sisi, or sickles, as they were called. And from these weapons these robbers got their denomination. And with these weapons they slew a great many. For they mingled themselves among the multitude at their festivals, when they were come up in crowds from all parts to the city to worship God, as we said before, and easily slew those that they had a mind to slay. They also came frequently upon the villages belonging to their enemies, with their weapons, and plundered them, and set them on fire. So Festus sent forces, both horsemen and footmen, to fall upon those that had been seduced by a certain impostor, who promised them deliverance and freedom from the miseries they were under, if they would but follow him as far as the wilderness. Accordingly, those forces that were sent destroyed both him that had deluded them, and those that were his followers also. 11. About the same time King Agrippa built himself a very large dining room in the royal palace at Jerusalem, near to the portico. Now this palace had been erected of old by the children of Asmoneus and was situated upon an elevation, and afforded a most delightful prospect to those that had a mind to take a view of the city, which prospect was desired by the king. And there he could lie down, and eat, and thence observe what was done in the temple. Which thing, when the chief men of Jerusalem saw, they were very much displeased at it. For it was not agreeable to the institutions of our country or law that what was done in the temple should be viewed by others, especially what belonged to the sacrifices. They therefore erected a wall upon the uppermost building which belonged to the inner court of the temple towards the west, which wall when it was built, did not only intercept the prospect of the dining room in the palace, but also of the western cloisters that belonged to the outer court of the temple also, where it was that the Romans kept guards for the temple at the festivals. At these doings both King Agrippa, and principally Festus the procurator, were much displeased. And Festus ordered them to pull the wall down again, but the Jews petitioned him to give them leave to send an embassage about this matter to Nero. For they said they could not endure to live if any part of the temple should be demolished. And when Festus had given them leave so to do, they sent 10 of their principal men to Nero, as also Ismail the high priest, and Helcias, the keeper of the sacred treasure. And when Nero had heard what they had to say, he not only forgave 22 them what they had already done, but also gave them leave to let the wall they had built stand. This was granted them in order to gratify Poppaea, Nero's wife, who was a religious woman, and had requested these favors of Nero, and who gave order to the 10 ambassadors to go their way home, but retain Helcias and Ismail as hostages with herself. As soon as the king heard this news, he gave the high priesthood to Joseph, who was called Kabi, the son of Simon, formerly high priest. Chapter 9. Concerning Albinus, under whose procuratorship James was slain. As also what edifices were built by Agrippa I. And now Cr. upon hearing the death of Festus, sent Albinus into Judea, as procurator. But the king deprived Joseph of the high priesthood, and bestowed the succession to that dignity on the son of Ananus, who was also himself called Ananus. Now the report goes that this eldest Ananus proved a most fortunate man. For he had 5 sons who had all performed the office of a high priest to God, and who had himself enjoyed that dignity a long time formerly, which had never happened to any other of our high priests. But this younger Ananus, who, as we have told you already, took the high priesthood, was a bold man in his temper, and very insolent. He was also of the sect of the Sadducees, 23, who are very rigid in judging offenders, above all the rest of the Jews, as we have already observed. When, therefore, Ananus was of this disposition, he thought he had now a proper opportunity to exercise his authority. Festus was now dead, and Albinus was but upon the road. So he assembled the Sanhedrim of judges, and brought before them the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, whose name was James, and some others, or some of his companions. And when he had formed an accusation against them as breakers of the law, he delivered them to be stoned. But as for those who seemed the most equitable of the citizens, and such as were the most uneasy at the breach of the laws, they disliked what was done. They also sent to the king Agrippa, desiring him to send to Ananus that he should act so no more, for that what he had already done was not to be justified. Nay, some of them went also to meet Albinus, as he was upon his journey from Alexandria, and informed him that it was not lawful for Ananus to assemble a Sanhedrim without his consent. 24. Whereupon Albinus complied with what they said, and wrote in anger to Ananus, and threatened that he would bring him to punishment for what he had done. On which King Agrippa took the high priesthood from him, when he had ruled but 3 months, and made Jesus, the son of Damnius, high priest. 2. Now as soon as Albinus was come to the city of Jerusalem, he used all his endeavors and care that the country might be kept in peace, and this by destroying many of the Sicarii. But as for the high priest, Ananias 25, he increased in glory every day, and this to a great degree, and had obtained the favor and esteem of the citizens in a signal manner. For he was a great hoarder up of money, he therefore cultivated the friendship of Albinus, and of the high priest Jesus, by making them presents. He also had servants who were very wicked, who joined themselves to the boldest sort of the people, and went to the thrashing floors, and took away the tithes that belonged to the priests by violence, and did not refrain from beating such as would not give these tithes to them. So the other high priests acted in the like manner, as did those his servants, without any one being able to prohibit them. So that some of the priests, that of old were wont to be supported with those tithes, died for want of food. 3. But now the Sicarii went into the city by night, just before the festival, which was now at hand, and took the scribe belonging to the governor of the temple, whose name was Eleazar, who was the son of Ananias the high priest, and bound him, and carried him away with them. After which they sent to Ananias, and said that they would send the scribe to him, if he would persuade Albinus to release 10 of those prisoners which he had caught of their party. So Ananias was plainly forced to persuade Albinus, and gained his request of him. This was the beginning of greater calamities. For the robbers perpetually contrived to catch some of Ananias's servants. And when they had taken them alive, they would not let them go, till they thereby recovered some of their own Sicarii. And as they were again become no small number, they grew bold, and were a great affliction to the whole country. 4. About this time it was that King Agrippa built Caesarea Philippi larger than it was before, and, in honor of Nero, named it Neronlas. And when he had built a theatre at Berytus, with vast expenses, he bestowed on them shows, to be exhibited every year, and spent therein many 10,000 drachmae. He also gave the people a largesse of corn, and distributed oil among them, and adorned the entire city with statues of his own donation, and with original images made by ancient hands. Nay, he almost transferred all that was most ornamental in his own kingdom thither. This made him more than ordinarily hated by his subjects, because he took those things away that belonged to them to adorn a foreign city. And now Jesus, the son of Gamaliel, became the successor of Jesus, the son of Damnius, in the high priesthood, which the king had taken from the other. On which account a sedition arose between the high priests, with regard to one another. For they got together bodies of the boldest sort of the people, and frequently came, from reproaches, to throwing of stones at each other. But Ananias was too hard for the rest, by his riches, which enabled him to gain those that were most ready to receive. Costobarus also, and Saulus, did themselves get together a multitude of wicked wretches, and this because they were of the royal family. And so they obtained favor among them, because of their kindred to Agrippa. But still they used violence with the people, and were very ready to plunder those that were weaker than themselves. And from that time it principally came to pass that our city was greatly disordered, and that all things grew worse and worse among us. 5. But when Albinus heard that Gessius Florus was coming to succeed him, he was desirous to appear to do somewhat that might be grateful to the people of Jerusalem. So he brought out all those prisoners who seemed to him to be most plainly worthy of death, and ordered them to be put to death accordingly. But as to those who had been put into prison on some trifling occasions, he took money of them, and dismissed them. By which means the prisons were indeed emptied, but the country was filled with robbers. 6. Now as many of the Levites, 26, which is a tribe of ours, as were singers of hymns, persuaded the king to assemble a Sanhedrim, and to give them leave to wear linen garments, as well as the priests, for they said that this would be a work worthy the times of his government, that he might have a memorial of such a novelty, as being his doing. Nor did they fail of obtaining their desire. For the king, with the suffrages of those that came into the Sanhedrim, granted the singers of hymns this privilege, that they might lay aside their former garments, and wear such a linen one as they desired. And as a part of this tribe ministered in the temple, he also permitted them to learn those hymns as they had besought him for. Now all this was contrary to the laws of our country, which, whenever they have been transgressed, we have never been able to avoid the punishment of such transgressions. 7. And now it was that the temple was finished. So when the people saw that the workmen were unemployed, who were above 18,000, and that they, receiving no wages, were in want because they had earned their bread by their labors about the temple, and while they were unwilling to keep by them the treasures that were there deposited, out of fear of their being carried away by the Romans, and while they had a regard to the making provision for the workmen, they had a mind to expend these treasures upon them. For if any one of them did but labor for a single hour, he received his pay immediately. So they persuaded him to rebuild the eastern cloisters. These cloisters belonged to the outer court, and were situated in a deep valley, and had walls that reached 400 cubits in length, and were built of square and very white stones, the length of each of which stones was 20 cubits, and their height 6 cubits. This was the work of King Solomon, 27, who first of all built the entire temple. But King Agrippa, who had the care of the temple committed to him by Claudius Cr., considering that it is easy to demolish any building, but hard to build it up again, and that it was particularly hard to do it to these cloisters, which would require considerable time, and great sums of money, he denied the petitioners their request about that matter. But he did not obstruct them when they desired the city might be paved with white stone. He also deprived Jesus, the son of Gamaliel, of the high priesthood, and gave it to Matthias, the son of Theophilus, under whom the Jews' war with the Romans took its beginning. Chapter 10. an enumeration of the high priests 1. And now I think it proper and agreeable to this history to give an account of our high priests. How they began, who those are which are capable of that dignity, and how many of them there had been at the end of the war. In the first place, therefore, history informs us that Aaron, the brother of Moses, officiated to God as a high priest, and that, after his death, his son succeeded him immediately. And that this dignity hath been continued down from them all to their posterity. Whence it is a custom of our country, that no one should take the high priesthood of God but he who is of the blood of Aaron, while every one that is of another stock, though he were a king, can never obtain that high priesthood. Accordingly, the number of all the high priests from Aaron, of whom we have spoken already, as of the first of them, until Phanes, who was made high priest during the war by the seditious, was 83. Of whom 13 officiated as high priests in the wilderness, from the days of Moses, while the tabernacle was standing, until the people came into Judea, when King Solomon erected the temple to God. For at the first they held the high priesthood till the end of their life, although afterward they had successors while they were alive. Now these 13, who were the descendants of 2 of the sons of Aaron, received this dignity by succession, one after another. For their form of government was an aristocracy, and after that a monarchy, and in the third place the government was regal. Now the number of years during the rule of these 13, from the day when our fathers departed out of Egypt, under Moses their leader, until the building of that temple which King Solomon erected at Jerusalem, were 612. After those 13 high priests, 18 took the high priesthood at Jerusalem, one in succession to another, from the days of King Solomon, until Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, made an expedition against that city, and burnt the temple, and removed our nation into Babylon, and then took Josephus, the high priest, captive. The times of these high priests were 466 years, 6 months, and 10 days, while the Jews were still under the regal government. But after the term of 70 years' captivity under the Babylonians, Cyrus, king of Persia, sent the Jews from Babylon to their own land again, and gave them leave to rebuild their temple. At which time Jesus, the son of Josephus, took the high priesthood over the captives when they were returned home. Now he and his posterity, who were in all 15, until King Antiochus Upater, were under a democratical government for 414 years. And then the forementioned Antiochus, and Lysias the general of his army, deprived Onias, who was also called Menelaus, of the high priesthood, and slew him at Berea. And driving away the son of Onias the third, put James into the place of the high priest, one that was indeed of the stock of Aaron, but not of that family of Onias. On which account Onias, who was the nephew of Onias that was dead, and bore the same name with his father, came into Egypt, and got into the friendship of Ptolemy Philometor, and Cleopatra his wife, and persuaded them to make him the high priest of that temple which he built to God in the prefecture of Heliopolis, and this in imitation of that at Jerusalem. But as for that temple which was built in Egypt, we have spoken of it frequently already. Now when Josephus had retained the priesthood 3 years, he died, and there was no one that succeeded him, but the city continued 7 years without a high priest. But then the posterity of the sons of Asmoneus, who had the government of the nation conferred upon them, when they had beaten the Macedonians in war, appointed Jonathan to be their high priest, who ruled over them 7 years. And when he had been slain by the treacherous contrivance of Trypho, as we have related somewhere, Simon his brother took the high priesthood. And when he was destroyed at a feast by the treachery of his son-in-law, his own son, whose name was Hyrcanus, succeeded him, after he had held the high priesthood 1 year longer than his brother. This Hyrcanus enjoyed that dignity 30 years, and died an old man, leaving the succession to Judas, who was also called Aristobulus, whose brother Alexander was his heir. Which Judas died of a sore distemper, after he had kept the priesthood, together with the royal authority. For this Judas was the first that put on his head a diadem for 1 year. And when Alexander had been both king and high priest 27 years, he departed this life, and permitted his wife Alexandra to appoint him that should be high priest. So she gave the high priesthood to Hyrcanus, but retained the kingdom herself 9 years, and then departed this life. The like duration, and no longer did her son Hyrcanus enjoy the high priesthood. For after her death his brother Aristobulus fought against him, and beat him, and deprived him of his principality. And he did himself both reign, and performed the office of high priest to God. But when he had reigned 3 years, and as many months, Pompey came upon him, and not only took the city of Jerusalem by force, but put him and his children in bonds, and sent them to Rome. He also restored the high priesthood to Hyrcanus, and made him governor of the nation, but forbade him to wear a diadem. This Hyrcanus ruled, besides his first 9 years, 24 years more, when Barzapharnes and Prochorus, the generals of the Parthians, passed over Euphrates, and fought with Hyrcanus, and took him alive, and made Antigonus, the son of Aristobulus, king. And when he had reigned 3 years and 3 months, Sosius and Herod besieged him, and took him, when Antony had him brought to Antioch, and slain there. Herod was then made king by the Romans, but did no longer appoint high priests out of the family of Asmoneus, but made certain men to be so that were of no eminent families, but barely of those that were priests, excepting that he gave that dignity to Aristobulus. For when he had made this Aristobulus, the grandson of that Hyrcanus who was then taken by the Parthians, and had taken his sister Mariamne to wife, he thereby aimed to win the goodwill of the people, who had a kind remembrance of Hyrcanus his grandfather. Yet did he afterward, out of his fear lest they should all bend their inclinations to Aristobulus, put him to death, and that by contriving how to have him suffocated as he was swimming at Jericho, as we have already related that matter. But after this man he never entrusted the priesthood to the posterity of the sons of Asmoneus. Archelaus also, Herod's son, did like his father in the appointment of the high priests, as did the Romans also, who took the government over the Jews into their hands afterward. Accordingly, the number of the high priests, from the days of Herod until the day when Titus took the temple and the city, and burnt them, were in all 28. The time also that belonged to them was 107 years. Some of these were the political governors of the people under the reign of Herod, and under the reign of Archelaus his son, although, after their death, the government became an aristocracy, and the high priests were entrusted with a dominion over the nation. And thus much may suffice to be said concerning our high priests. Chapter 11. Concerning Florus the procurator, who necessitated the Jews to take up arms against the Romans. The conclusion 1. Now Gessius Florus, who was sent as successor to Albinus by Nero, filled Judea with abundance of miseries. He was by birth of the city of Clazermene, and brought along with him his wife Cleopatra, by whose friendship with Poppaea, Nero's wife, he obtained this government, who was no way different from him in wickedness. This Florus was so wicked, and so violent in the use of his authority, that the Jews took Albinus to have been comparatively their benefactor. So excessive were the mischiefs that he brought upon them. For Albinus concealed his wickedness, and was careful that it might not be discovered to all men. But Gessius Florus, as though he had been sent on purpose to show his crimes to everybody, made a pompous ostentation of them to our nation, as never omitting any sort of violence, nor any unjust sort of punishment. For he was not to be moved by pity, and never was satisfied with any degree of gain that came in his way. Nor had he any more regard to great than to small acquisitions, but became a partner with the robbers themselves. For a great many fell then into that practice without fear, as having him for their security, and depending on him, that he would save them harmless in their particular robberies. So that there were no bounds set to the nation's miseries. But the unhappy Jews, when they were not able to bear the devastations which the robbers made among them, were all under a necessity of leaving their own habitations, and of flying away, as hoping to dwell more easily anywhere else in the world among foreigners than in their own country. And what need I say any more upon this head? Since it was this Florus who necessitated us to take up arms against the Romans, while we thought it better to be destroyed at once, than by little and little. Now this war began in the 2nd year of the government of Florus, and the 12th year of the reign of Nero. But then what actions we were forced to do, or what miseries we were enabled to suffer, may be accurately known by such as will peruse those books which I have written about the Jewish war. 2. I shall now, therefore, make an end here of my Antiquities. After the conclusion of which events, I began to write that account of the war. And these Antiquities contain what hath been delivered down to us from the original creation of man, until the 12th year of the reign of Nero, as to what hath befallen the Jews, as well in Egypt as in Syria and in Palestine, and what we have suffered from the Assyrians and Babylonians, and what afflictions the Persians and Macedonians, and after them the Romans, have brought upon us. For I think I may say that I have composed this history with sufficient accuracy in all things. I have attempted to enumerate those high priests that we have had during the interval of 2000 years. I have also carried down the succession of our kings, and related their actions, and political administration, without considerable errors, as also the power of our monarchs. And all according to what is written in our sacred books. For this it was that I promised to do in the beginning of this history. And I am so bold as to say, now I have so completely perfected the work I proposed to myself to do, that no other person, whether he were a Jew or foreigner, had he ever so great an inclination to it, could so accurately deliver these accounts to the Greeks as is done in these books. For those of my own nation freely acknowledge that I far exceed them in the learning belonging to Jews. I have also taken a great deal of pains to obtain the learning of the Greeks, and understand the elements of the Greek language, although I have so long accustomed myself to speak our own tongue, that I cannot pronounce Greek with sufficient exactness. For our nation does not encourage those that learn the languages of many nations, and so adorn their discourses with the smoothness of their periods. Because they look upon this sort of accomplishment as common, not only to all sorts of free men, but to as many of the servants as please to learn them. But they give him the testimony of being a wise man who is fully acquainted with our laws, and is able to interpret their meaning. On which account, as there have been many who have done their endeavors with great patience to obtain this learning, there have yet hardly been so many as 2 or 3 that have succeeded therein, who were immediately well rewarded for their pains. 3. And now it will not be perhaps an invidious thing, if I treat briefly of my own family, and of the actions of my own life 28 while there are still living such as can either prove what I say to be false, or can attest that it is true. With which accounts I shall put an end to these Antiquities, which are contained in 20 books, and 60,000 verses. And if God permit me, I will briefly run over this war 29, and to add what befell them further to that very day, the 13th of Domitian, or AD 3, is not, that I have observed, taken distinct notice of by any one. Nor do we ever again, with what befell us therein to this very day, which is the 13th year of the reign of Cr Domitian, and the 56th year of my own life. I have also an intention to write 3 books concerning our Jewish opinions about God and His essence, and about our laws. Why, according to them, some things are permitted us to do, and others are prohibited. Footnotes. 1. Return here is some error in the copies, or mistake in Josephus. For the power of appointing high priests, Alter Herod king of Chalcis was dead, and Agrippa, Jr., was made king of Chalcis in his room, belonged to him. And he exercised the same all along till Jerusalem was destroyed, as Josephus elsewhere informs us, ch. 8 sect. 11. ch. 9 sect. 1, 4, 6, 7. 2. Return Josephus here uses the word monogene, an only begotten son, for no other than one best beloved, as does both the Old and New Testament, I mean where there were 1 or more sons besides, Genesis 22:2. Hebrew 11-17. See the note on BICH. 13 sect. 1. 3. Return. It is here very remarkable, that the remains of Noah's Ark were believed to be still in being in the days of Josephus. See the note on BICH. 3 sect. 5. For return Josephus is very full and express in these 3 chapters, 3, 4, and 5, in observing how carefully divine providence preserved the Sizetes, king of Adiabene, and his sons, while he did what he thought was his bounden duty, notwithstanding the strongest political motives to the contrary. 5. Return this further account of the benefactions of Isaetes and Helena to the Jerusalem Jews which Josephus here promises is, I think, nowhere performed by him in his present works. But of this terrible famine itself in Judea, take Dr. Hudson's note here. This says he is that famine foretold by Agabus, Acts 11-28, which happened when Claudius was consul the 4th time. And not that other which happened when Claudius was consul the 2nd time, and Cesena was his colleague, as Scaliger says upon Eusebius, pages 174. Now when Josephus had said a little afterward, ch. 5 sect. 2, that Tiberius Alexander succeeded Cuspius Fadus as procurator, he immediately subjoins, that under these procurators there happened a great famine in Judea. Whence it is plain that this famine continued for many years, on account of its duration under these 2 procurators. Now Fadus was not sent into Judea till after the death of King Agrippa, that is towards the latter end of the 4th year of Claudius. So that this famine foretold by Agabus happened upon the 5th, 6th, and 7th years of Claudius, as says Valesius on Oisb. II. 12. Of this famine also, and Queen Helena's supplies, and her monument, see Moses Chironensis, pages 144, 145, where it is observed in the notes that Pausanias mentions that her monument also. 6. Return this privilege of wearing the tiara upright, or with the tip of the cone erect, is known to have been of old peculiar to great kings, from Xenophon and others, as Dr. Hudson observes here. 7. Return this conduct of Isaetes is a sign that he was become either a Jew, or an Ebionite Christian, who indeed differed not much from proper Jews. Ch. 6 sect. 1. However, his supplications were heard, and he was providentially delivered from that imminent danger he was in. 8. Return these pyramids or pillars, erected by Helena, queen of Adiabene, near Jerusalem, 3 in number, are mentioned by Eusebius, in his Ecles. Hist. B. Ch. 12, for which Dr. Hudson refers us to Valesius's notes upon that place. They are also mentioned by Pausanias, as hath been already noted, ch. 2 sect. 6. Roland guesses that the now called Absalom's pillar may be one of them. 9. Return this Theudas, who arose under Fadus the procurator, about AD 45 or 46, could not be that Theudas who arose in the days of the taxing, under Cyrenius, or about AD 7, Acts v. 36, 37. Who that earlier Theudas was, see the note on BXVII. Ch. 10 sect. 5. 10. Return this and many more tumults and seditions which arose at the Jewish festivals, in Josephus, illustrate the cautious procedure of the Jewish governors, when they said, Matthew 26-5, Let us not take Jesus on the feast day, lest there be an uproar among the people. As Roland well observes on Tin's place. Josephus also takes notice of the same thing, of the war, Bich. 4 sect. 3. 11. Return this constant passage of the Galileans through the country of Samaria, as they went to Judea and Jerusalem, illustrates several passages in the Gospels to the same purpose, as Dr. Hudson rightly observes. See Luke 17-11. John 4-4. See also Josephus in his own life, sect. 52, where that journey is determined to 3 days. 12. Return our Savior had foretold that the Jews' rejection of his gospel would bring upon them, among other miseries, these 3, which they themselves here show they expected would be the consequences of their present tumults and seditions, the utter subversion of their country, the conflagration of their temple, and the slavery of themselves, their wives, and children. See Luke 21, 6-24. 13. Return this Simon, a friend of Felix, a Jew, born in Cyprus, though he pretended to be a magician, and seems to have been wicked enough, could hardly be that famous Simon the magician, in the Acts of the Apostles, 8-9, etc., as some are ready to suppose. This Simon mentioned in the Acts was not properly a Jew, but a Samaritan, of the town of Gidi, in the country of Samaria, as the Apostolical Constitutions, 6-7, the recognitions of Clement, 2nd 6, and Justin Martyr, himself born in the country of Samaria, Apology, I-34, inform us. He was also the author, not of any ancient Jewish, but of the first Gentile heresies, as the forementioned authors assure us. So I suppose him a different person from the other. I mean this only upon the hypothesis that Josephus was not misinformed as to his being a Cypriot Jew. For otherwise the time, the name, the profession, and the wickedness of them both would strongly incline one to believe them the very same. As to that Drusilla, the sister of Agrippa, Jr., as Josephus informs us here, and a Jewess, as St. Luke informs us, Acts 24-24, whom this Simon mentioned by Josephus persuaded to leave her former husband, Azizus, king of Emesa, a proselyte of Justus, and to marry Felix, the heathen procurator of Judea, Tacitus, Hist. v. 9, supposes her to be a heathen, and the granddaughter of Antonius and Cleopatra, contrary both to St. Luke and Josephus. Now Tacitus lived somewhat too remote, both as to time and place, to be compared with either of those Jewish writers, in a matter concerning the Jews in Judea in their own days, and concerning a sister of Agrippa, Jr., with which Agrippa Josephus was himself so well acquainted. It is probable that Tacitus may say true, when he informs us that this Felix who had in all 3 wives, or queens, as Suetonius and Claudius, sect. 28, assures us did once marry such a grandchild of Antonius and Cleopatra. And finding the name of one of them to have been Drusilla, he mistook her for that other wife, whose name he did not know. 14. Return. This eruption of Vesuvius was one of the greatest we have in history. See Bianchini's curious and important observations on this Vesuvius, and its 7 several great eruptions, with their remains vitrified, and still existing, in so many different strata underground, till the diggers came to the antediluvian waters, with their proportionable interstices, implying the deluge to have been above 2,500 years before the Christian era, according to our exactest chronology. 15. Return. This is now wanting. 16. Return. This also is now wanting. 17. Return. This duration of the reign of Claudius agrees with Dio, as Dr. Hudson here remarks. As he also remarks that Nero's name, which was at first L. Domitius Enobarbus, after Claudius had adopted him was Nero Claudius Cr. Drusus Germanicus. This alias as own life, sect. 11. As also by Dio Cassius and Thames, as Dr. Hudson informs us. 18. Return. This agrees with Josephus's frequent accounts elsewhere in his own life, that Tibetans, Antaricha, and Gamala were under this Agrippa, Jr., till Justus, the son of Pistus, seized for the Jews, upon the breaking out of the war. 19. Return. This treacherous and barbarous murder of the good high priest Jonathan, by the contrivance of this wicked procurator, Felix, was the immediate occasion of the ensuing murders by the Sicarii or ruffians, and one great cause of the following horrid cruelties and miseries of the Jewish nation, as Josephus here supposes. Whose excellent reflection on the gross wickedness of that nation, as the direct cause of their terrible destruction, is well worthy the attention of every Jewish and of every Christian reader. And since we are soon coming to the catalogue of the Jewish high priests, it may not be amiss, with Roland, to insert this Jonathan among them, and to transcribe his particular catalogue of the last 28 high priests, taken out of Josephus, and begin with Ananlas, who was made by Herod the Great. See Antic. BXV. Ch. 2 sect. 4, and the note there. 1. Ananlas. 2. Aristobulus. 3. Jesus, the son of Phabus. 4. Simon, the son of Boethus. 5. Matthias, the son of Theophilus 6. Jusar, the son of Boethus 7. Eleazar, the son of Boethus 8. Jesus, the son of Sic 9. Annas, or Ananus, the son of Seth 10. Ismail, the son of Phabus 11. Eleazar, the son of Ananus 12. Simon, the son of Comithus 13. Josephus Caiaphas, the son-in-law to Ananus 14. Jonathan, the son of Ananus 15. Theophilus, his brother, and son of Ananus 16. Simon, the son of Boethus 17. Matthias, the brother of Jonathan, and son of Ananus 18. Algonius 19. Josephus, the son of Camillus 20. Ananias, the son of Nebedius 21. Jonathas 22. Ismail, the son of Phabi 23. Joseph Kabi, the son of Simon 24. Annas, the son of Ardanus 25. Jesus, the son of Damnatus 26. Jesus, the son of Gamaliel 27. Matthias, the son of Theophilus 28. Phannias, the son of Samuel. As for Ananus and Joseph Caiaphas, here mentioned about the middle of this catalogue, they are no other than those Annas and Caiaphas so often mentioned in the four Gospels. And that Ananias, the son of Nebedius, was that high priest before whom St. Paul pleaded his own cause, Acts 24. 20. Return of these Jewish impostors and false prophets, with many other circumstances and miseries of the Jews, till their utter destruction, foretold by our Saviour. See Liticumble of Prof. Pages 58 to 75. Of this Egyptian impostor, and the number of his followers, in Josephus, see Acts 21 to 38. 21. Return. The wickedness here was very peculiar and extraordinary, that the high priests should so oppress their brethren the priests, as to starve the poorest of them to death. See the like presently, ch. 9 sect. 2. Such fatal crimes are covetousness and tyranny in the clergy, as well as in the laity, in all ages. 22. Return. We have here one eminent example of Nero's mildness and goodness in his government towards the Jews, during the first 5 years of his reign, so famous in antiquity. We have perhaps another in Josephus's own life, sect. 3. And a third, though of a very different nature here, in sect. 9. Just before. However, both the generous acts of kindness were obtained of Nero by his queen Poppia, who was a religious lady, and perhaps privately a Jewish proselyte, and so were not owing entirely to Nero's own goodness. 23. Return. It hence evidently appears that Sadducees might be high priests in the days of Josephus, and that these Sadducees were usually very severe and inexorable judges, while the Pharisees were much milder, and more merciful, as appears by Relland's instances in his note on this place, and on Josephus's life, sect. 31, and those taken from the New Testament, from Josephus himself, and from the rabbins. Nor do we meet with any Sadducees later than this high priest in all Josephus. 24. Return of this condemnation of James the Just, and its causes, as also that he did not die till long afterwards, see Prim. Christ. Revived, Vol. ch. 43-46. The Sanhedrin condemned our Saviour, but could not put him to death without the approbation of the Roman procurator. Nor could therefore Ananias and his Sanhedrim do more here, since they never had Albinus's approbation for the putting this James to death. 25. Return. This Ananias was not the son of Nebedius, as I take it, but he who was called Annas or Ananus the elder, the 9th in the catalogue, and who had been esteemed high priest for a long time. And, besides Caiaphas, his son-in-law, had 5 of his own sons high priests after him, which were those of Numbers 11, 14, 15, 17, 24, in the foregoing catalogue. Nor ought we to pass slightly over what Josephus here says of Annas, or Ananias, that he was high priest a long time before his children were so. He was the son of Seth, and is set down first for high priest in the foregoing catalogue, under number 9. He was made by Quirinius, and continued till Ismail, the 10th in number, for about 23 years, which long duration of his high priesthood, joined to the successions of his son-in-law, and 5 children of his own, made him a sort of perpetual high priest, and was perhaps the occasion that former high priests kept their titles ever afterwards. For I believe it is hardly met with before him. 26. Return this insolent petition of some of the Levites, to wear the sacerdotal garments when they sung hymns to God in the temple, was very probably owing to the great depression and contempt the haughty high priests had now brought their brethren the priests into. Of which ch. 8 sect. 8, and ch. 9 sect. 2. 27. Return of these cloisters of Solomon, see the description of the temple, ch. 13. They seem, by Josephus's words, to have been built from the bottom of the valley. 28. Return see the life at the beginning of the volume. 29. Return what Josephus here declares his intention to do, if God permitted, to give the public again an abridgment of the Jewish war. Hear of it elsewhere, whether he performed what he now intended or not. Some of the reasons of this design of his might possibly be his observation of the many errors he had been guilty of in the 2 first of those 7 books of the war, which were written when he was comparatively young, and less acquainted with the Jewish antiquities than he now was, and in which abridgment we might have hoped to find those many passages which himself, as well as those several passages which others refer to, as written by him, but which are not extant in his present works. However, since many of his own references to what he had written elsewhere, as well as most of his own errors, belong to such early times as could not well come into this abridgment of the Jewish war, and since none of those that quote things not now extant in his works, including himself as well as others, ever cite any such abridgment, I am forced rather to suppose that he never did publish any such work at all. I mean, as distinct from his own life, written by himself, for an appendix to these Antiquities, and this at least 7 years after these Antiquities were finished. Nor indeed does it appear to me that Josephus ever published that other work here mentioned, as intended by him for the public also, I mean the 3 or 4 books concerning God and his essence, and concerning the Jewish laws. Why, according to them, some things were permitted the Jews, and others prohibited. Which last seems to be the same work which Josephus had also promised, if God permitted, at the conclusion of his preface to these Antiquities. Nor do I suppose that he ever published any of them. The death of all his friends at court, Vespasian, Titus, and Domitian, and the coming of those he had no acquaintance with to the crown, I mean Nerva and Trajan, together with his removal from Rome to Judea, with what followed it, might easily interrupt such his intentions, and prevent his publication of those works.